Beyond the physical boundaries of real space lies a dimension that defies every natural law governing the material universe. The Immaterium, known throughout the galaxy by countless names, the Warp, the Sea of Souls, the Realm of Chaos, exists as a parallel reality of pure psychic energy and raw emotion. This turbulent ocean of consciousness has coexisted with the physical universe since the moment of creation itself, forming an inseparable duality that defines the very nature of existence. The Warp represents the collective unconscious of all sentient life, a roiling mass of thoughts, dreams, fears, and desires given form through psychic resonance. Unlike the ordered cosmos of real space, where matter follows predictable patterns and energy obeys thermodynamic principles, the Immaterium operates according to entirely different rules. Here, belief shapes reality, emotion manifests as tangible force, and the boundaries between thought and substance dissolve into meaningless abstractions. Within this psychic realm, the accumulated psychic emanations of every thinking being across the galaxy flow like tributaries feeding an endless storm. Each mortal's consciousness contributes to the vast currents of the Warp, their emotional states and mental activity adding to the chaotic symphony that defines the Immaterium's nature. A single human's moment of rage might create barely perceptible ripples, but when billions of beings experience similar emotions simultaneously, these psychic emanations coalesce into devastating tempests capable of tearing holes between dimensions. The relationship between the material universe and the Immaterium operates through constant interaction. Every psychically active species unknowingly feeds the Warp through their very existence, their thoughts and emotions seeping through the barrier between dimensions like water through a permeable membrane. The Eldar, with their heightened psychic sensitivity, contribute particularly intense emanations that burn bright in the Warp's currents. Humanity, despite individual humans possessing relatively weak psychic potential, generates enormous collective influence through sheer numbers spread across millions of worlds. Even seemingly mundane activities possess psychic resonance within the Warp. The focused concentration of a tech adept performing maintenance rituals, the desperate prayers of Imperial citizens facing Xeno's invasion, the battle fury of space marines locked in combat, all these experiences translate into psychic energy that flows into the Immaterium. The cumulative effect of quadrillions of sentient beings living, fighting, loving, and dying creates the fundamental substrate from which the Warp draws its power. The Immaterium's geography, if such terms can apply to a realm without physical space, shifts constantly according to the psychic currents flowing through it. Regions of relative calm might exist where peaceful worlds contribute gentle emanations, while areas fed by war-torn systems rage with violent energies that manifest as literal storms of destruction. The Warp responds to these influences with frightening immediacy. A sector consumed by civil war might see the local Immaterium transform into a hellscape of burning psychic matter within solar days. Understanding the fundamental differences between the Materium and Immaterium requires abandoning conventional concepts of reality. In real space, physical laws govern every interaction. Gravity pulls objects toward massive bodies. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. Causality flows in linear progression from cause to effect. These principles form the bedrock upon which technological advancement and scientific understanding operate throughout the galaxy. The Warp recognizes none of these limitations. Within the Immaterium, thoughts possess weight, emotions generate heat, and memories can achieve independent existence. A particularly vivid recollection of a long-dead warrior might manifest as a semi-permanent psychic construct, complete with the skills and knowledge the original possessed. Concepts that exist purely as abstractions in real space, honor, corruption, hope, despair, take on literal substance within the Warp, forming landscapes of crystallized emotion that stretch across impossible distances. Time itself behaves erratically within the Immaterium. Linear progression from past to future becomes meaningless when past events can influence their own causes, and future possibilities exist simultaneously with present realities. Navigators attempting to guide void ships through Warp transit regularly encounter temporal anomalies, where their vessels emerge at destinations before they departed, or arrive decades after their intended timeline despite, experiencing only hours of subjective travel time. The absence of physical laws creates opportunities and dangers that real space cannot comprehend. Psychic energy can be shaped into tools more effective than any material implement, but these same forces can turn destructive without warning. A psyker's concentrated willpower might temporarily impose order on local warp currents, creating stable corridors for travel or communication, but the same effort could trigger cascading failures that tear reality apart across light years of space. Causality within the warp operates through symbolic rather than mechanical relationships. Events connect not through direct physical interaction, but through thematic resonance and emotional significance. A ritual performed on one world might influence outcomes on distant planets if the symbolic connections prove strong enough, regardless of whether any physical mechanism exists to transmit such influence. This symbolic causality explains how chaos cults can coordinate activities across galactic distances without conventional communication, their shared beliefs creating psychic links that transcend space and time. The malleable nature of warp reality means that strongly held beliefs can literally reshape local conditions. A group of cultists convinced that their dark rituals will summon demonic entities may find their expectations fulfilled not through supernatural intervention, but because their collective belief creates the psychic conditions necessary for such manifestations. Conversely, the unwavering faith of Imperial citizens can generate protective effects that shield them from warp-based attacks, their shared conviction creating barriers of crystallized belief. These fundamental differences make direct interaction between the two dimensions inherently unstable. When warp energies intrude into real space, they bring their chaotic properties with them, causing mutations, temporal distortions, and reality breakdowns that persist until the intrusion dissipates or is forcibly contained. Similarly, when material objects enter the warp, they become subject to the Immaterium's symbolic logic, potentially transforming according to their perceived significance rather than their physical properties. Psykers serve as the primary conduits through which the two dimensions interact, their minds naturally attuned to perceive and manipulate psychic energies that remain invisible to normal humans. These individuals possess neural structures that can process warp emanations directly, translating the chaotic energies of the Immaterium into effects within real space. The strength of a psyker's abilities correlates directly with how deeply their consciousness can penetrate the barrier between dimensions. When psykers exercise their powers, they create temporary rifts in the fabric separating the Materium from the Immaterium. These openings allow warp energy to flow into real space in controlled quantities, enabling the manifestation of psychic phenomena ranging from telepathic communication to pyrokinetic attacks. However, each use of psychic power weakens the dimensional barrier around the psyker, making subsequent breaches easier to achieve, but also more dangerous to control. The process of channeling warp energy through a human mind creates inherent instabilities that can cascade beyond the psyker's ability to contain. A sanctioned psyker attempting to divine enemy positions might inadvertently create a permanent scrying window that allows hostile entities to observe Imperial activities. An astropath transmitting urgent communications could tear open a warp rift large enough for demonic entities to pour through, transforming a vital message into a catastrophic invasion. These dimensional breaches follow patterns that reflect the psyker's mental state and the nature of their abilities. Combat psykers channeling aggressive emotions tend to create rifts that burn with destructive energy, while those focused on healing or protection generate openings that pulse with restorative force. The psychic signature of each breach attracts corresponding entities from the warp. Violent rifts draw predatory demons, while peaceful openings might attract more benign but equally dangerous warp phenomena. Untrained psykers present exponentially greater risks because they lack the mental discipline necessary to control their interactions with the warp. Their uncontrolled psychic emanations create constant micro-rifts that weaken reality's fabric around them, eventually leading to catastrophic breaches that can consume entire population centers. The Imperium's brutal policies toward unsanctioned psykers stem from hard-learned experience with such disasters, where individual psychic awakening has triggered demonic incursions that required entire space marine companies to contain. The strength of psychic abilities varies enormously among human populations, with most individuals possessing only trace sensitivity that manifests as occasional intuition or empathic awareness. These minor talents rarely create significant dimensional disturbances, but their collective effect across billions of humans generates the constant psychic background radiation that feeds the warp's human-influenced regions. Stronger psychers capable of conscious power manipulation represent statistical anomalies, appearing perhaps once in every million births, but their potential impact on dimensional stability makes their identification and control a priority for Imperial authorities. Advanced psychers who survive training and achieve true mastery of their abilities learn to perceive the warp's currents directly, experiencing the Immaterium as a vast ocean of swirling energies rather than the chaotic nightmare it appears to untrained minds. These individuals can navigate psychic space with relative safety, using their understanding of warp dynamics to predict and avoid the most dangerous currents while drawing upon stable energy sources for their powers. The interaction between psychers and the warp creates feedback loops that influence both dimensions simultaneously. A psycher's emotional state affects the type of warp energy they can access, while prolonged exposure to specific psychic currents gradually shapes their personality and capabilities. Battle psychers who regularly channel destructive forces often develop increasingly aggressive temperaments, while those who focus on healing abilities may find themselves compulsively drawn to alleviate suffering wherever they encounter it. The constant psychic emanations flowing from sentient minds across the galaxy did not merely create abstract energies within the warp. Over millions of years, these emotional currents began to coalesce into distinct patterns, forming concentrated nodes of psychic power that gradually developed their own consciousness. The birth of the Chaos Gods represents the ultimate manifestation of this process, primordial entities born from the collective psyche of entire species, each embodying fundamental aspects of mortal experience that transcend individual civilizations. The first of these entities to achieve true consciousness emerged from humanity's earliest conflicts during the species' prehistoric expansion across Terra. In the blood-soaked millennia, when primitive human tribes fought endless wars for territory and resources, every act of violence fed growing currents of rage and martial fury within the warp. The psychic resonance of countless battles, the desperate fury of warriors facing death, and the primal satisfaction derived from victory over enemies created an ever-strengthening vortex of aggressive energy that eventually achieved independent existence. Khorne manifested as the blood god sometime during humanity's ancient history, his consciousness crystallizing from the accumulated psychic emanations of warfare that had raged across Terra for generations. Unlike the chaotic energies that surrounded his formation, Khorne emerged with a singular focus that reflected the nature of his birth, an eternal hunger for combat, bloodshed, and the honor found in martial prowess. His domain within the warp became a reflection of this obsession, a realm of brass fortresses and endless battlefields where the concepts of courage and slaughter achieved physical form. The blood god's influence extended far beyond humanity's wars, drawing power from every species that engaged in violent conflict throughout the galaxy. The ritualistic combat of the Eldar's warrior aspects, the brutal tribal warfare of orc clans, and the predatory hunts of countless Xeno species all contributed to Khorne's growing strength. Each death in battle, each moment of rage-fueled combat, and each warrior's final stand against overwhelming odds added another thread to the tapestry of psychic energy that sustained the blood god's existence. Khorne's manifestation established patterns that would define all subsequent Chaos God formations. His consciousness emerged not as a singular moment of creation, but as a gradual coalescence of compatible psychic energies that reached critical mass over extended periods. The process resembled the formation of stellar bodies from cosmic dust, with scattered emotional emanations slowly drawing together under their own psychic gravity until they achieved sufficient density to support independent thought and will. While Khorne drew strength from humanity's capacity for violence, another entity began forming from equally fundamental but more complex emotional currents. The human drive for progress, the ambition that pushed civilizations to expand beyond their limitations, and the intellectual curiosity that sought to understand and manipulate natural forces created different patterns within the warp. These emanations, colored by hope for the future and the desire for change, gradually coalesced into a consciousness that embodied transformation itself. Tzeentch achieved awareness through humanity's developing sophistication in magic and politics during the species' early civilizational development. Unlike Khorne's straightforward manifestation from combat, the Changer of Ways emerged from the more subtle psychic emanations generated by scheming minds and ambitious souls. Every political conspiracy, each attempt to manipulate others for personal gain, and all efforts to reshape reality through arcane knowledge contributed to the growing psychic mass that eventually became the architect of fate. The formation of Tzeentch demonstrated how chaos gods could embody contradictory concepts simultaneously. His domain encompassed both the hope that drove positive change and the corruption that accompanied unchecked ambition. The same psychic currents that fed his power from idealistic reformers also drew strength from manipulative sorcerers and power-hungry politicians. This duality became a defining characteristic of Tzeentch's nature, making him perhaps the most complex of the Chaos Gods in terms of the emotional spectrum he represented. Tzeentch's influence spread through species that developed sophisticated magical traditions or complex political systems. The Eldar's mastery of psychic disciplines provided particularly rich emanations for the Changer of Ways, as did their elaborate social hierarchies and the constant scheming that characterized their society's upper echelons. Even non-psychic species contributed to Tzeentch's power through their capacity for long-term planning and their efforts to impose order on chaotic circumstances. The third primordial entity to achieve consciousness emerged from perhaps the most universal of mortal experiences, the inevitability of decay and the despair that accompanied the recognition of mortality. While Khorne fed on active violence and Tzeentch drew power from dynamic change, this new consciousness formed around the static emotions associated with entropy, disease, and the acceptance of inevitable decline. The psychic emanations of plague victims, the despair of civilizations facing extinction, and the strange comfort found in surrendering to decay created currents within the warp that gradually developed their own awareness. Nurgle's birth occurred during humanity's early encounters with pandemic diseases that swept across Terra's growing population centers. The collective suffering of millions dying from plague, the despair of survivors watching their civilizations crumble, and the gradual acceptance that death was the natural endpoint of all existence created psychic resonances that coalesced into the plague god's consciousness. Unlike his brother gods, Nurgle emerged with a paradoxical nature that found joy in decay and comfort in despair, transforming negative emotions into a twisted form of contentment. The Plague Father's domain reflected this paradoxical relationship with entropy, manifesting as a realm where decay and growth existed in perfect balance. His garden within the warp became a place where diseases bloomed like flowers and rotting matter provided fertile ground for new forms of life. This cyclical understanding of existence, where death enabled rebirth and corruption created opportunities for different forms of growth, distinguished Nurgle from gods of simple destruction or pure entropy. Nurgle's influence extended to every species that experienced disease, aging, and death, making him perhaps the most universally relevant of the Chaos Gods. The natural life cycle of organic beings provided constant sustenance for his power, while the emotional responses to mortality, fear, acceptance, despair, and strange relief created the complex psychic emanations that sustained his consciousness. Even species with extended lifespans or advanced medical technology contributed to Nurgle's strength through their awareness of eventual decay and their efforts to stave off entropy. These three entities, Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, established themselves as the primary powers within the warp during humanity's prehistoric development, drawing additional strength from the psychic emanations of countless other species throughout the galaxy. Their domains within the Immaterium became vast territories of crystallized emotion, each reflecting the fundamental aspects of mortal experience that had given birth to their consciousness. The constant flow of compatible psychic energy from the material universe sustained and strengthened these entities over millions of years. The balance between the three gods created complex dynamics within the warp that influenced the flow of psychic energy throughout the Immaterium. Khorne's straightforward aggression often conflicted with Tzeentch's subtle manipulations, while both opposed Nurgle's acceptance of stagnation and decay. These conflicts manifested as literal wars within the warp, with demonic armies clashing across psychic battlefields that stretched across impossible distances. The outcomes of these conflicts influenced the relative strength each god could project into the material universe. For millions of years, this trinity of chaos gods dominated the warp's conscious entities, their combined influence shaping the Immaterium's geography and determining how psychic energy flowed between dimensions. Other entities existed within the warp, fragments of consciousness from dead civilizations, psychic echoes of extinct species, and various lesser demons that had achieved independent existence, but none possessed the concentrated power and focused will of the three primary gods. The stability of this arrangement persisted until the emergence of a species whose psychic potential far exceeded anything the galaxy had previously produced. The Eldar's evolution created beings whose every emotion burned with intensity that dwarfed the psychic emanations of other species. Their heightened sensitivity to the warp meant that their thoughts and feelings translated into psychic energy with unprecedented efficiency, creating currents within the Immaterium that rivaled the output of entire human worlds. During the height of their empire, the Eldar's psychic emanations provided sustenance for all three chaos gods, but their cultural development began creating new patterns within the warp. As Eldar civilization reached its technological and artistic peaks, their society gradually turned toward increasingly sophisticated forms of pleasure-seeking. The pursuit of perfect experiences, the exploration of every possible sensation, and the development of art forms that directly stimulated psychic centers created emotional emanations unlike anything the galaxy had previously produced. The Eldar's quest for ultimate sensation began generating psychic currents focused on pleasure, excess, and the pursuit of perfect experience. These emanations differed fundamentally from the straightforward emotions that had birthed the existing chaos gods. Where Khorne drew power from simple rage and martial fury, these new currents embodied complex relationships between pain and pleasure, creation and destruction, love and obsession. The psychic resonance of Eldar pursuing ever more extreme experiences created patterns within the warp that began coalescing into something entirely unprecedented. Over several millennia, Eldar society became increasingly obsessed with sensation and experience, pushing the boundaries of what their enhanced physiology and psychic abilities could endure. Their pursuit of perfection in all forms of stimulation, artistic, physical, emotional, and psychic, created feedback loops that amplified their emanations within the warp. Each new extreme they explored generated stronger psychic resonances, which in turn influenced other Eldar to seek even greater heights of sensation. The gradual formation of this new consciousness within the warp went unnoticed by most Eldar, who remained focused on their material pursuits. Those few Farseers who perceived the growing psychic disturbance found their warnings dismissed by a society too intoxicated by its own capabilities to recognize the danger building within the Immaterium. The psychic emanations continued to strengthen and coalesce, drawing power not only from active pleasure seekers, but also from the growing undercurrent of boredom and dissatisfaction that pervaded Eldar society. The entity taking shape within the warp embodied the paradoxes inherent in the Eldar's pursuit of ultimate experience. It drew power from both ecstasy and agony, from the creation of beauty and its inevitable destruction, from the heights of love and the depths of obsession. These contradictory impulses created a consciousness that was fundamentally different from the relatively straightforward natures of the existing chaos gods, one that would embody excess in all its forms, rather than focusing on a single aspect of mortal experience. The psychic mass building within the warp reached critical density sometime during the 30th millennium, but its final manifestation required a catalyst of unprecedented psychic violence. The Eldar Empire's descent into hedonistic excess had created the necessary conditions for the new god's birth, but the actual moment of consciousness required a psychic implosion of sufficient magnitude to crystallize the accumulated emanations into independent awareness. That catalyst came when Eldar society finally crossed the threshold from sophisticated pleasure-seeking into outright depravity. The pursuit of perfect sensation had led increasing numbers of Eldar to explore experiences that combined pleasure with pain, creation with destruction, and love with violation. These activities generated psychic emanations of such intensity that they began creating feedback effects within the warp, amplifying the emotional resonance of each act and driving participants to seek even greater extremes. The psychic pressure building within the Immaterium reached breaking point when the accumulated emanations of millions of years of Eldar excess achieved sufficient density to collapse into consciousness. The moment of Slaanesh's birth created a psychic implosion that tore through the warp with devastating force, its effects rippling across both dimensions simultaneously. The newborn god's first scream of existence shattered the barriers between the Materium and Immaterium across vast regions of space. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth struck the Eldar with particular devastation because their heightened psychic sensitivity made them unable to shield themselves from the god's overwhelming presence. Across the galaxy, Eldar died instantly as their souls were torn from their bodies and consumed by the newborn deity's insatiable hunger. Entire worlds populated by billions of Eldar simply ceased to exist as their inhabitants' life force fed Slaanesh's first moments of consciousness. The destruction extended beyond individual deaths to encompass the very fabric of space within the Eldar Empire's core territories. The psychic implosion created a permanent wound in reality that became known as the Eye of Terror, a region where the warp and material universe existed in constant overlap. Within this zone, the normal laws of physics became meaningless as warp energy flowed freely into real space, creating a hellscape where thought and emotion took physical form. Slaanesh's manifestation fundamentally altered the balance of power within the warp by introducing an entity whose nature differed significantly from the existing Chaos gods. Where Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle had each emerged from relatively straightforward emotional emanations, Slaanesh embodied the complex interplay between opposing sensations and experiences. This complexity made the Prince of Pleasure both more unpredictable and more adaptable than the other gods, capable of drawing power from a broader spectrum of mortal experiences. The birth of the fourth Chaos God completed what became known as the Ruinous Powers, establishing the pantheon that would dominate warp consciousness for the remainder of galactic history. Each god embodied fundamental aspects of sentient experience, Khorne representing the warrior's fury and honor in battle, Tzeentch embodying the scholar's ambition and the politician's cunning, Nurgle reflecting acceptance of mortality and the comfort found in decay, and Slaanesh incarnating the pursuit of sensation and the corruption of perfection. The interaction between these four entities created the Great Game, an eternal conflict that determined the flow of power within the warp and influenced events throughout the material universe. Unlike mortal warfare, this struggle operated on multiple levels simultaneously: direct confrontation between demonic armies, subtle manipulation of psychic currents, and complex schemes that might take millennia to reach fruition. The gods' competing interests ensured that no single entity could achieve permanent dominance over the others. The Great Game's dynamics reflected each god's fundamental nature and the types of psychic emanations that sustained their power. Khorne's straightforward aggression led him to favor direct confrontation, launching massive demonic invasions against his rivals' territories within the warp. These attacks succeeded through overwhelming force, but rarely achieved lasting victories, because Khorne's nature prevented him from engaging in the subtle territorial consolidation necessary for permanent conquest. Tzeentch approached the Great Game through elaborate schemes that often involved manipulating events in the material universe to influence the flow of psychic energy within the warp. The Changer of Ways might orchestrate political upheavals across multiple sectors, to generate the specific types of ambitious emanations that strengthened his position relative to his rivals. These plans often succeeded through their sheer complexity, but Tzeentch's compulsive need to introduce additional complications frequently caused his own schemes to collapse. Nurgle's participation in the Great Game reflected his acceptance of cyclical processes and inevitable change. The Plague Father rarely initiated aggressive actions against his rivals, instead focusing on maintaining his existing territories while gradually expanding through patient corruption of adjacent regions. His strategies succeeded through persistence rather than dramatic action, slowly converting neutral areas of the warp to his influence through the steady application of decay and entropy. Slaanesh's approach to the Great Game combined elements of all the other gods' strategies, while adding unique tactics that reflected the Prince of Pleasure's complex nature. The youngest Chaos God could match Khorne's aggression when the situation demanded direct action, employ schemes as elaborate as Tzeentch's when subtlety served better, or demonstrate patience rivaling Nurgle's when gradual corruption proved most effective. This adaptability made Slaanesh perhaps the most dangerous opponent in the Great Game's eternal conflicts. The constant warfare between the Chaos Gods created fluctuations in their relative power that influenced their ability to project influence into the material universe. When one god gained temporary advantage in the Great Game, their increased strength allowed them to sponsor more demonic incursions, empower additional mortal servants, and corrupt larger regions of real space. These periods of ascendancy rarely lasted long because the other gods would inevitably combine forces to restore the balance. The Great Game's outcomes determined which types of chaos corruption would dominate different regions of the galaxy at any given time. A sector where Khorne held temporary advantage might experience increased warfare, as the Blood God's influence inspired conflicts between previously peaceful populations. Areas under Tzeentch's sway could see the rise of sorcerous cults and political upheavals that reshaped entire civilizations. Nurgle's dominance brought plague and stagnation, while Slaanesh's influence corrupted populations through the pursuit of increasingly extreme experiences. Despite their eternal conflicts, the four Chaos Gods shared certain fundamental interests that occasionally brought them into temporary alliance. All four entities depended on psychic emanations from sentient life for their continued existence, making them natural enemies of any force that threatened to reduce the galaxy's population of thinking beings. The emergence of threats like the Necron's galaxy-wide awakening or Tyranid hive fleets could prompt unprecedented cooperation between normally antagonistic gods. These alliances remained inherently unstable because each god's nature prevented them from truly trusting their rivals. Khorne's straightforward aggression made him suspicious of any plan involving subtlety, while Tzeentch's compulsive scheming led him to introduce complications even into cooperative efforts. Nurgle's acceptance of inevitable change made him unreliable when decisive action was required, and Slaanesh's pursuit of novel experiences often caused the Prince of Pleasure to abandon successful strategies in favor of more interesting alternatives. The Chaos God's influence extended throughout the galaxy through networks of mortal servants who channeled their patron's power into the material universe. These cultists, sorcerers, and corrupted officials provided the gods with detailed information about conditions in real space while serving as conduits for demonic influence. The competition between rival cults reflected the Great Game's conflicts, with servants of different gods working to advance their patrons' interests often at the expense of their rivals' followers. The relationship between the Chaos Gods and their mortal servants demonstrated how the warp's symbolic logic influenced events in real space. Cultists who demonstrated appropriate devotion to their chosen deity could receive power that far exceeded their natural capabilities, but this empowerment came with the risk of eventual corruption or consumption. The gods viewed their mortal followers as useful tools rather than valued allies, discarding servants who outlived their usefulness or failed to provide adequate psychic sustenance. The eternal conflict between the Chaos Gods shapes not only the currents of the warp, but defines the very nature of corruption that seeps into the material universe. Each of these primordial entities embodies fundamental aspects of mortal experience, their domains encompassing both the noble and debased expressions of sentient consciousness. Understanding their individual characteristics reveals how different forms of chaos corruption manifest throughout the galaxy, from the blood-soaked battlefields, where Khorne's influence runs strongest, to the plague-ridden worlds, where Nurgle's gifts take root. Khorne stands as the most straightforward of the ruinous powers, his nature reflecting the primal fury that drives warriors into battle and the honor found in martial combat. The Blood God's domain within the Warp manifests as an endless expanse of brass fortresses and crimson battlefields, where the concepts of courage and bloodshed achieve physical form. Massive ziggurats constructed from skulls rise from plains of congealed gore, their surfaces gleaming with the reflected light of a sky that burns perpetually red. Rivers of blood flow between these monuments to violence, carrying the psychic echoes of every death in battle throughout galactic history. The architecture of Khorne's realm reflects his dual nature as both the patron of honorable warriors and the god of mindless slaughter. Towering citadels built from brass and bone serve as barracks for his demonic legions, their walls adorned with weapons taken from fallen champions across countless worlds. These fortresses follow no architectural logic comprehensible to mortal minds, their geometries shifting to accommodate the endless flow of martial spirits that seek glory in the Blood God's service. Training grounds stretch between the citadels, where demonic entities practice combat techniques that blend the fighting styles of every warrior culture the galaxy has ever produced. Khorne draws his power from every act of violence committed in anger or desperation, but he shows particular favor for combat that demonstrates skill, courage, and martial honor. The fury of a space marine charging into overwhelming odds generates stronger psychic emanations than the random violence of underhive gangers, though both contribute to the Blood God's strength. This preference for quality over mere quantity means that a single duel between master swordsmen can provide more sustenance than dozens of murders committed in cowardice or for personal gain. The Blood God's hatred of psykers and sorcery stems from his fundamental nature as a deity of direct action and honest combat. Psychic powers represent everything Khorne despises about warfare, the use of trickery and manipulation to achieve victory rather than relying on strength, skill, and courage. Sorcerers who hide behind magical barriers, while their enemies die to arcane attacks, embody the antithesis of the martial virtues Khorne values. This antipathy extends beyond individual psykers to encompass any form of supernatural manipulation that allows combatants to avoid direct confrontation. The prohibition against sorcery creates unique dynamics among Khorne's mortal followers, who must achieve their goals through purely physical means. Khornate cultists develop exceptional skills with conventional weapons, their dedication to martial training driven by religious fervor as much as practical necessity. These warriors often display supernatural resistance to psychic attacks, not through magical protection, but because their absolute faith in physical combat creates mental barriers that psykers find difficult to penetrate. Khorne's demons reflect their patrons' martial preferences through their appearance and behavior. Bloodletters manifest as muscular humanoids with crimson skin and brass armor, their forms optimized for close combat rather than intimidation or supernatural powers. These entities wield hellblades that can cut through any material substance, but they possess no psychic abilities beyond their inherent connection to the warp. Greater demons like bloodthirsters tower above their lesser kin, their massive frames combining the physical power of legendary warriors with the accumulated martial knowledge of countless battles. The Blood God's influence in the material universe manifests through increased aggression and the glorification of combat among affected populations. Worlds touched by Khorne's corruption experience rising rates of violence as previously peaceful citizens find themselves drawn to settle disputes through force. Military organizations under Khornate influence develop increasingly aggressive doctrines that prioritize assault tactics over defensive strategies, leading to campaigns that generate massive casualties on both sides, but produce decisive victories through sheer audacity. Khornate corruption spreads through warrior cultures with particular efficiency because it amplifies existing values rather than replacing them entirely. Honor guards who take pride in their martial prowess find their dedication gradually transforming into bloodthirsty obsession. Planetary defense forces that begin by seeking to protect their homes eventually evolve into raiding parties that attack neighboring systems purely for the glory of battle. This progression often occurs so gradually that the affected warriors never recognize how far they have strayed from their original principles. The Blood Gods servants establish cults that center around combat training and the worship of violence as a spiritual discipline. These organizations attract recruits from military veterans, gladiatorial fighters, and anyone who has experienced the intoxicating rush of life or death combat. Khornate cults maintain extensive armories filled with weapons from across the galaxy, viewing the collection and mastery of different fighting styles as acts of religious devotion. Their ceremonies involve ritual combat that frequently results in death, the spilled blood serving as offerings to their patron deity. Unlike the other Chaos gods, Khorne shows no interest in elaborate schemes or long-term planning beyond the immediate goal of generating more warfare. His influence operates through direct inspiration rather than subtle manipulation, filling his followers with battle fury that drives them to seek combat regardless of strategic considerations. This straightforward approach makes Khornate corruption easier to identify than other forms of chaos influence, but also more difficult to stop once it takes hold, because affected individuals become genuinely convinced that violence represents the highest form of human achievement. Tzeentch presents a stark contrast to Khorne's straightforward nature, embodying the complexity and contradiction inherent in the pursuit of change and knowledge. The Changer of Ways rules over a domain within the warp that defies any attempt at coherent description, its geography shifting constantly according to the flow of ambition and scheming that feeds the god's power. Crystalline towers that stretch toward impossible heights suddenly transform into labyrinthine libraries filled with books that write themselves, while gardens of living mathematics bloom with equations that solve themselves before dissolving into new problems. The architecture of Tzeentch's realm reflects the god's mastery over mutation and transformation. Structures built from pure thought take physical form before melting back into abstract concepts, their brief existence serving purposes that only the architect of fate comprehends. Bridges constructed from crystallized hope span chasms of despair, while staircases made of ambition lead to platforms of disappointment that somehow connect to towers of renewed determination. The constant flux prevents any permanent mapping of the domain, as passages that exist one moment may lead to entirely different destinations the next. Tzeentch draws power from every act of planning, scheming, and ambition, regardless of whether the underlying goals are noble or corrupt. The psychic emanations of an imperial administrator working to improve planetary governance provide sustenance alongside those of a heretical cult leader plotting to overthrow the local government. This indiscriminate appetite for change-oriented thought makes Tzeentch perhaps the most universally relevant of the Chaos gods, as virtually every sentient being engages in some form of planning or aspiration. The god's mastery over sorcery stems from his fundamental connection to the pursuit of knowledge and the desire to manipulate reality through understanding its hidden mechanisms. Psychic powers represent the ultimate expression of this drive, allowing practitioners to reshape the material world through force of will guided by arcane knowledge. Tzeentch views sorcerers as his most valuable servants because they embody the perfect synthesis of ambition and learning that defines his nature. Tzeentchian sorcery operates through complex rituals that require extensive knowledge of warp dynamics and symbolic relationships. These practitioners spend decades mastering the theoretical foundations necessary to channel their patron's power safely, studying texts that describe the mathematical relationships between emotion and psychic energy. Their spells achieve effects that seem miraculous to outside observers, but follow precise formulas that account for every variable involved in manipulating warp currents. The Changer of Ways encourages mutation as a form of blessing that demonstrates his power to reshape reality according to his will. These transformations rarely follow predictable patterns, instead reflecting the symbolic significance of the recipient's relationship with change and ambition. A scholar who dedicates his life to understanding forbidden knowledge might develop additional eyes that can perceive psychic phenomena, while a politician skilled at manipulation could grow extra limbs that allow him to literally pull more strings simultaneously. Tzeentchian demons embody their patron's connection to change and sorcery through forms that shift constantly between different configurations. Horrors of Tzeentch appear as writhing masses of colored flame that sprout temporary limbs and sensory organs as needed, their physical structure adapting to whatever task they currently perform. These entities possess extensive psychic abilities that allow them to manipulate probability, alter perceptions, and reshape local reality within limited parameters. The influence of Tzeentch in the material universe manifests through increased political complexity and the proliferation of sorcerous knowledge among affected populations. Worlds touched by the changer of ways experience Byzantine political situations, where every faction maintains multiple conflicting agendas, creating webs of alliance and betrayal that grow more complex over time. Academic institutions under Tzeentchian influence develop curricula that gradually introduce students to increasingly dangerous forms of knowledge, eventually producing scholars who view forbidden research as necessary for intellectual advancement. Tzeentchian corruption spreads through existing power structures by amplifying the natural ambitions of individuals in positions of authority. Planetary governors who begin with genuine desires to improve their worlds find themselves drawn into increasingly complex schemes that prioritize personal advancement over public welfare. Military commanders develop strategies of such elaborate complexity that they become ends in themselves, with the original objectives of their campaigns forgotten in favor of demonstrating intellectual superiority over their enemies. The cults of Tzeentch operate as secret societies that combine political conspiracy with sorcerous practice, attracting members from the educated classes who possess both the knowledge necessary to understand the gods' teachings and the ambition to implement them. These organizations maintain extensive libraries filled with texts on political theory, arcane mathematics, and forbidden history, viewing the accumulation of knowledge as a form of worship. Their ceremonies involve complex rituals that serve multiple purposes simultaneously, advancing the cult's political objectives while providing psychic sustenance to their patron deity. Tzeentchian schemes operate across timescales that dwarf mortal comprehension, with individual plots requiring centuries or millennia to reach fruition. The god servants often find themselves implementing plans whose ultimate purposes remain unknown to them, their roles limited to executing specific phases of larger strategies. This compartmentalization protects the overall scheme from discovery, while ensuring that individual cultists remain motivated by their belief that they serve important functions in their patron's grand design. Nurgle represents the inevitable entropy that awaits all living things, but his domain encompasses far more than simple death and decay. The Plague Father rules over the complete cycle of existence, from the corruption that enables new forms of life to emerge through the acceptance of mortality that brings peace to suffering souls. His realm within the warp manifests as a vast garden where disease blooms like flowers and rotting matter, provides fertile ground for impossible forms of growth. The Garden of Nurgle stretches across psychic distances that have no equivalent in real space, its boundaries encompassing swamps of congealed pus, forests of diseased trees that bear fruit made from living plague, and meadows where flowers constructed from crystallized despair release spores of acceptance and resignation. Rivers of bile flow between these regions, carrying nutrients that sustain ecosystems based on decay and regeneration. The garden's inhabitants include every form of disease and parasite that has ever existed, evolved into new configurations that serve their patron's vision of perfect entropy. Nurgle draws power from every experience related to disease, decay, and the acceptance of mortality, but he shows particular favor for those who find comfort in their suffering or peace in their inevitable death. The psychic emanations of plague victims who accept their fate with resignation provide stronger sustenance than those who rage against their condition. This preference for acceptance over resistance reflects the god's fundamental nature as a deity of cycles rather than endings, viewing death as merely another phase in the eternal process of transformation. The Plague Father's gifts take the form of diseases that serve as blessings rather than curses, transforming recipients into living examples of his power, while freeing them from the fear of death that plagues normal mortals. These infections operate according to supernatural principles that defy medical understanding, creating symbiotic relationships between host and pathogen that benefit both parties. Nurgle's chosen develop immunity to pain and fear, while gaining the ability to spread their patrons' gifts to others through contact or proximity. Nurglite diseases exhibit characteristics that reflect their divine origin through their ability to adapt and evolve in response to treatment attempts. Medical efforts to combat these infections often result in new strains that incorporate resistance to the specific countermeasures employed against them. This adaptive capability ensures that Nurgle's plagues remain eternally relevant regardless of technological advancement, as each new medical breakthrough merely provides opportunities for the diseases to develop more sophisticated survival mechanisms. The demons of Nurgle embody their patrons' connection to decay and regeneration through forms that combine repulsive appearance with unexpected vitality. Plaguebearers manifest as walking corpses whose rotting flesh teems with parasitic life, their bodies serving as mobile ecosystems that support countless smaller organisms. These entities feel no pain from their condition, instead experiencing a constant state of euphoric contentment that reflects their patron's gift of freedom from suffering. Nurgle's influence in the material universe manifests through the spread of supernatural plagues that affect not only biological organisms, but also mechanical systems and abstract concepts. Worlds touched by the Plague Father experience equipment failures that follow patterns resembling organic disease, with machine spirits becoming infected by digital plagues that cause systematic breakdowns across entire technological networks. Social institutions under Nurglite influence develop forms of corruption that spread through bureaucratic channels, creating administrative diseases that cause governmental systems to decay from within. The corruption of Nurgle spreads through populations that have experienced significant suffering or loss, as the god's message of acceptance resonates strongly with those who have endured hardship. Refugees from war-torn worlds prove particularly susceptible to Nurglite influence because their experiences have already taught them that life involves inevitable pain and loss. Medical personnel who witness constant death and suffering sometimes find comfort in the Plague Father's teachings that present decay as a natural and even beneficial process. Nurglite cults operate as support networks for individuals who have accepted their mortality and found peace in the knowledge that all things must eventually decay. These organizations provide comfort to the sick, elderly, and despairing, offering a philosophy that transforms suffering into spiritual achievement. Their ceremonies involve the cultivation and sharing of sacred diseases, with members viewing infection as a form of communion that binds them together in their patron's love. The Plague Father's servants work to spread his gifts through acts of compassion that simultaneously advance their patron's agenda and provide genuine relief to suffering populations. Nurglite healers offer treatments that eliminate pain and fear, while introducing subtle infections that gradually transform recipients into willing servants of decay. These medical missionaries operate with complete sincerity, genuinely believing that they provide valuable services to communities that lack adequate health care. Slaanesh stands as the youngest and perhaps most complex of the Chaos Gods, embodying the pursuit of sensation and experience that drives sentient beings to transcend their limitations. The Dark Prince rules over a domain within the Warp that reflects every possible form of aesthetic and sensory experience, from the most sublime artistic achievements to the most debased forms of hedonistic excess. This realm shifts between configurations of impossible beauty and horrific corruption, often presenting both simultaneously to demonstrate how closely perfection and degradation relate to each other. The Palace of Slaanesh manifests as a structure that incorporates architectural elements from every civilization that has ever pursued artistic excellence, its halls decorated with masterpieces that induce overwhelming emotional responses in viewers. Galleries filled with paintings that move and change according to the observer's desires connect to concert halls where music plays that directly stimulates the listener's psychic centers. Gardens of living sculpture populate courtyards where the boundaries between art and reality dissolve, creating spaces where aesthetic experience becomes indistinguishable from physical sensation. Slaanesh draws power from every act of creation and consumption, every pursuit of excellence, and every indulgence in excess. The psychic emanations of an artist struggling to achieve perfect expression provide sustenance alongside those of a hedonist pursuing increasingly extreme pleasures. This broad appetite for experience-oriented activity makes the Prince of Pleasure relevant to virtually every aspect of civilized existence, as most cultural achievements involve some element of aesthetic pursuit or sensory exploration. The god's connection to perfection manifests through an obsession with achieving flawless execution in every endeavor, regardless of whether the activity itself serves constructive or destructive purposes. Slaaneshi corruption often begins with legitimate desires for excellence that gradually transform into compulsive perfectionism that consumes all other considerations. Artists under the Dark Prince's influence produce works of stunning beauty that require increasingly extreme methods to achieve, eventually leading to creations that incorporate suffering and corruption as essential elements. Slaaneshi excess operates according to principles of escalation that drive participants to seek constantly intensifying experiences. What begins as appreciation for fine wine evolves into consumption of increasingly exotic substances, while interest in martial arts develops into obsession with inflicting and receiving pain. This progression follows psychological patterns that make each new level of intensity seem like a natural development rather than a dangerous escalation. The demons of Slaanesh embody their patron's dual nature through forms that combine irresistible beauty with subtle hints of corruption and danger. Demonettes appear as graceful humanoids whose perfect proportions and flawless features inspire immediate attraction, but closer examination reveals predatory characteristics like razor-sharp claws and expressions of barely contained hunger. These entities move with hypnotic grace that makes observers forget the danger they represent until the moment of attack. Slaanesh's influence in the material universe manifests through the corruption of cultural institutions and the transformation of legitimate artistic pursuits into vehicles for spreading the god's gifts. Worlds touched by the Dark Prince experience flowering of creative achievement that produces works of unprecedented beauty and sophistication. But these cultural renaissances inevitably evolve into decadent movements that prioritize sensation over meaning. The corruption of Slaanesh spreads through populations that have achieved sufficient prosperity and security to pursue aesthetic and sensory experiences beyond basic survival needs. Civilizations at the height of their cultural development prove most susceptible to Slaaneshi influence because their citizens possess both the resources and the sophistication necessary to appreciate the subtle forms of corruption the Dark Prince offers. Artists, performers, and intellectuals serve as primary vectors for this influence because their work naturally involves the pursuit of excellence and the exploration of new forms of expression. Slaaneshi cults operate as exclusive societies that combine artistic patronage with the pursuit of increasingly extreme experiences, attracting members from the cultural elite who possess both the wealth necessary to fund elaborate activities and the sophistication to appreciate their patrons' gifts. These organizations maintain extensive collections of art, music, and literature from across the galaxy, viewing aesthetic appreciation as a form of worship that connects them to their god's divine nature. The servants of Slaanesh work to spread their patrons' influence through the creation and distribution of cultural works that gradually introduce audiences to new forms of sensory experience. Slaaneshi artists produce pieces that appear innocuous to casual observation, but contain subtle elements that stimulate psychological responses in viewers, creating desires for more intense experiences that eventually lead to active corruption. These cultural missionaries operate with genuine artistic passion, believing that they serve to elevate civilization by by introducing populations to higher forms of aesthetic achievement. The vast armies that serve the ruinous powers operate according to rigid hierarchical structures that reflect each god's fundamental nature, while providing the organizational framework necessary to wage the eternal conflicts of the great game. These demonic legions consist of entities whose existence spans the spectrum from barely conscious psychic fragments to primordial beings whose power rivals that of the gods themselves. Understanding these hierarchies reveals how chaos projects its influence into the material universe through carefully orchestrated campaigns that combine brute force with supernatural manipulation. At the apex of each god's demonic hierarchy stand the greater demons, entities of such immense power that their manifestation in real space requires extraordinary circumstances and vast expenditures of psychic energy. These beings serve as their patron deities' primary agents in the material universe, possessing the intelligence and authority necessary to command massive demonic incursions while retaining enough individual personality to adapt their strategies to local conditions. Each greater demon embodies the purest expression of their god's nature, their forms and abilities reflecting the specific aspects of mortal experience that feed their patron's power. Bloodthirsters represent Khorne's wrath made manifest, their towering forms combining the physical perfection of legendary warriors with the accumulated fury of every battle ever fought. These entities stand twice the height of a space marine, their crimson skins stretched over frames of corded muscle that radiate barely contained violence. Massive wings of tattered flesh spread from their shoulders, not for flight, but as displays of dominance that cast shadows of dread across entire battlefields. Their heads merge bestial features with expressions of intelligent malice sporting horns that can gore through ceramite armor and fangs capable of tearing through reinforced bone. Each bloodthirster wields weapons forged from the essence of rage itself, typically manifesting as massive axes or swords that burn with psychic fire. These hellblades can cleave through any material substance while inflicting wounds that resist healing through conventional or supernatural means. The weapons respond to their wielder's emotional state, growing larger and more destructive as the demon's fury intensifies during combat. Some bloodthirsters carry whips woven from the spinal cords of defeated champions, using these implements to drag enemies into close combat where their superior strength ensures victory. The presence of a bloodthirster on the battlefield transforms the nature of warfare itself, as the demon's psychic aura amplifies the aggressive instincts of every combatant within several kilometers. Allied forces experience supernatural courage that drives them to attempt impossible feats of valor, while enemy units find their discipline eroding under waves of induced bloodlust that turn organized resistance into chaotic melee. The demon's roar can shatter fortifications while inspiring berserker fury in previously rational soldiers, creating tactical advantages that no conventional military doctrine can counter. Lords of Change serve as Tzeentch's primary agents of manipulation and transformation, their forms reflecting the Changer of Way's mastery over mutation and sorcery. These entities appear as massive avian creatures whose bodies shift constantly between different configurations, their feathers displaying colors that exist only within the warp's psychic spectrum. Multiple eyes cover their forms in seemingly random patterns, each organ capable of perceiving different aspects of reality simultaneously. Their beaks can speak in any language, while their talons manipulate probability itself through gestures that reshape local causality. The sorcerous abilities of Lords of Change exceed those of any mortal psyker, allowing them to alter fundamental aspects of reality within their immediate vicinity. These demons can transform solid matter into psychic energy, reverse the flow of time within limited areas, or create illusions so convincing that they achieve independent existence. Their magic operates through complex mathematical formulas that account for every variable affecting the desired outcome, with spells that might require years of calculation by human scholars being completed instantaneously through supernatural intelligence. Lords of Change prefer manipulation to direct confrontation, using their vast knowledge of past and future events to orchestrate situations that serve their patrons' interests. These entities might spend decades positioning key individuals in positions of authority, creating circumstances that will eventually lead to massive political upheavals. Their schemes often involve multiple layers of deception, with apparent goals serving as distractions from deeper objectives that might not become apparent for centuries after implementation. Great Unclean Ones embody Nurgle's gifts of disease and acceptance, their massive forms demonstrating how corruption can coexist with vitality and even joy. These entities appear as enormously obese humanoids, whose rotting flesh teems with parasitic life forms that serve as extensions of their consciousness. Open wounds across their bodies weep fluids that support entire ecosystems of microscopic organisms, while their breath carries plagues that can infect entire populations through airborne transmission. Despite their horrific appearance, Great Unclean Ones radiate an aura of paternal affection that makes their presence oddly comforting to those who have accepted mortality. The diseases carried by Great Unclean Ones operate according to supernatural principles that allow them to infect not only biological organisms, but also mechanical systems and abstract concepts. Their plagues can cause machine spirits to develop symptoms resembling organic illness, while social institutions exposed to their influence begin exhibiting patterns of decay that spread through bureaucratic channels like viral infections. These supernatural contagions resist conventional treatment because they exist partially within the warp, requiring specialized knowledge of demonic nature to combat effectively. Great Unclean Ones approach warfare with the patience of entropy itself, preferring to weaken enemies through gradual corruption rather than direct assault. Their presence on battlefields transforms the environment into breeding grounds for supernatural diseases that affect equipment as well as personnel. Weapons jam due to infections of their machine spirits, while communication systems develop symptoms that cause messages to decay during transmission. The demon's laughter spreads despair that saps the will to fight, while their embrace offers release from suffering through acceptance of inevitable defeat. Keepers of Secrets represent Slaanesh's pursuit of perfect sensation, their forms combining irresistible beauty with subtle hints of predatory danger. These entities appear as tall, graceful humanoids whose proportions achieve mathematical perfection according to aesthetic principles from countless civilizations. Their skin displays colors that shift according to the observer's preferences, while their movements flow with hypnotic grace that makes witnesses forget the threat they represent. Multiple arms allow them to wield weapons while simultaneously performing gestures that enhance their supernatural allure. The abilities of Keepers of Secrets operate through direct manipulation of sensory perception and emotional response, allowing them to appear as whatever their target finds most attractive or desirable. These illusions extend beyond visual appearance to encompass voice, scent, and even psychic emanations that trigger specific psychological responses. The demon's presence induces states of euphoric fascination that make resistance seem not only impossible but undesirable, as victims find themselves genuinely grateful for the opportunity to experience such perfect sensation. Keepers of Secrets excel at corrupting enemy commanders through seduction and manipulation, using their understanding of mortal psychology to identify and exploit individual weaknesses. These demons might appear as lost lovers, idealized versions of the target's own appearance, or embodiments of abstract concepts like artistic perfection. Their conversations reveal intimate knowledge of their victims' desires and fears, creating emotional connections that bypass rational analysis and establish psychological dominance through manufactured intimacy. Below the greater demons in each hierarchy serve countless lesser demons, entities whose existence depends entirely on their connection to their patron deity, but who lack the individual power necessary to manifest independently in real space. These beings serve as the foot soldiers in the eternal wars of the Great Game, their specialized abilities reflecting different aspects of their god's domain, while providing the tactical flexibility necessary for complex military operations. Bloodletters form the backbone of Khorne's demonic legions, their crimson forms optimized for close combat in any environment. These entities stand roughly human height, but possess muscular frames that radiate supernatural strength, their skin bearing the color of freshly spilled blood, while their eyes burn with flames that reflect their patron's fury. Each bloodletter carries a hellblade forged from crystallized rage, weapons that can cut through any material while leaving wounds that resist both medical treatment and psychic healing. Their movements combine the precision of master swordsmen with the relentless aggression of berserkers, creating combat styles that prioritize maximum carnage over personal survival. The tactical doctrine of bloodletter units emphasizes direct assault against enemy positions, with formations that maintain cohesion through shared bloodlust rather than formal discipline. These demons coordinate their attacks through psychic links that allow them to respond instantly to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining the aggressive momentum that defines Khornate warfare. Individual bloodletters show no fear of death because their existence within the warp ensures eventual resurrection, making them willing to attempt suicidal attacks that would break the morale of mortal troops. Pink horrors serve as Tzeentch's primary demonic infantry, their constantly shifting forms reflecting their patron's mastery over change and mutation. These entities appear as writhing masses of colored flame that sprout temporary limbs and sensory organs as needed, their physical structure adapting continuously to whatever task they currently perform. Multiple faces emerge from their substance at random intervals, each expressing different emotions while speaking in languages that change mid-sentence. Their bodies burn with psychic fire that causes no harm to the demon itself, but can incinerate enemies through direct contact. The sorcerous abilities of pink horrors allow them to manipulate probability and alter local reality within limited parameters, making them effective both as combatants and as agents of broader corruption. These demons can cause weapons to misfire at critical moments, create illusions that confuse enemy formations, or generate psychic static that disrupts communication systems. Their magic operates through collective effort, with groups of horrors combining their individual abilities to achieve effects that would require greater demons to accomplish alone. When destroyed, pink horrors undergo a transformation that reflects Tzeentch's nature as the god of change, splitting into two blue horrors that retain portions of their predecessor's consciousness and abilities. These smaller entities possess reduced individual power, but maintain the same capacity for sorcery, while gaining increased mobility and cunning. Blue horrors often survive battles that destroy their parent entities, using their diminished size to infiltrate enemy positions, where they can cause disruption through sabotage and psychological warfare. Plaguebearers constitute Nurgle's demonic infantry, their rotting forms demonstrating how corruption can coexist with purpose and even contentment. These entities appear as walking corpses, whose decomposing flesh provides habitat for countless parasitic organisms, their bodies serving as mobile ecosystems that spread their patrons gifts wherever they travel. Open wounds across their forms weep infectious fluids, while their breath carries airborne pathogens capable of affecting both biological and mechanical systems. Despite their horrific appearance, Plaguebearers maintain expressions of resigned acceptance that reflect their patrons' teachings about the inevitability of decay. The weapons carried by Plaguebearers consist of rusted blades and corroded implements that inflict wounds guaranteed to become infected with supernatural diseases. These infections resist conventional treatment while spreading to affect the victim's equipment and companions, creating expanding zones of corruption that persist long after the original battle concludes. The demon's presence transforms battlefields into breeding grounds for plague, with their footsteps leaving patches of diseased ground that continue generating contagion for years afterward. Plaguebearers approach combat with the patience of entropy itself, maintaining steady advances that wear down enemy resistance through attrition rather than overwhelming assault. Their supernatural resilience allows them to absorb tremendous damage without losing effectiveness, while their diseases gradually weaken opposing forces through cumulative exposure. These demons feel no urgency because they understand that time itself serves their patron's agenda, making them willing to conduct siege warfare that might last for decades if necessary to achieve victory. Demonettes represent Slaanesh's pursuit of perfect sensation through combat that combines lethality with aesthetic grace. These entities appear as lithe humanoids whose proportions achieve mathematical perfection according to beauty standards from multiple species, their movements flowing with hypnotic elegance that makes their deadly intent seem like artistic performance. Razor-sharp claws extend from their fingertips, while their expressions maintain seductive smiles even during the most violent combat, creating psychological dissonance that confuses enemies about their true nature. The combat style of demonettes emphasizes speed and precision over brute force, with attacks that target specific nerve clusters and pressure points to maximize both damage and sensation. These demons can inflict wounds that cause excruciating pain or overwhelming pleasure according to their victim's psychological profile, using their understanding of sensory response to create experiences that transcend simple physical damage. Their presence on battlefields transforms warfare into performance art, with each kill executed with theatrical flair that serves both tactical and aesthetic purposes. Demonettes excel at psychological warfare through their ability to appear as whatever their enemies find most attractive or disturbing, often shifting between these extremes during combat to maintain psychological dominance. Their voices can mimic those of loved ones, while their scent triggers specific emotional responses, creating sensory experiences that bypass rational thought and establish direct emotional connections with their targets. This manipulation makes them particularly effective against enemy commanders, whose decision-making becomes compromised by induced emotional states. Above the lesser demons, but below the greater demons in each hierarchy, serve various specialized entities that fulfill specific roles within their patron's domain. These beings possess greater individual power than common demons, while retaining enough flexibility to adapt their abilities to changing circumstances, making them valuable assets for complex operations that require both supernatural power and tactical intelligence. Demon princes occupy a unique position within the chaos hierarchies as ascended mortals who have earned their patron deity's ultimate reward through extraordinary acts of devotion and corruption. These entities retain their original personalities and memories while gaining power that rivals that of greater demons, creating beings who understand both mortal psychology and demonic nature. Their transformation reflects the specific nature of their patron god, while incorporating elements of their original species and individual characteristics. The process of becoming a demon prince requires achievements that demonstrate complete dedication to a chosen god's principles, while generating sufficient psychic emanations to attract divine attention. Warriors who achieve this ascension through service to Khorne typically do so by orchestrating campaigns that generate massive casualties while demonstrating personal courage in countless battles. Their transformed state grants them supernatural strength and resilience while maintaining their tactical intelligence and leadership abilities. Sorcerers who achieve demonhood through service to Tzeentch undergo transformations that enhance their psychic abilities while granting them forms that can channel vast amounts of warp energy without suffering the limitations that constrain mortal flesh. These demon princes retain their accumulated knowledge while gaining access to sorcerous techniques that would destroy unprotected minds, making them formidable opponents who combine scholarly understanding with supernatural power. Individuals who earn Nurgle's favor through spreading disease and accepting corruption receive transformations that make them living embodiments of their patron's gifts. These demon princes become walking plague vectors whose presence can infect entire populations, while their supernatural resilience allows them to survive in environments that would kill any mortal creature. Their ascension grants them understanding of disease and decay that extends beyond biological processes to encompass social and mechanical systems. Those who achieve demonhood through service to Slaanesh undergo transformations that perfect their ability to experience and provide sensation, while granting them forms that embody their patron's aesthetic ideals. These demon princes retain their original personalities while gaining the ability to manipulate sensory perception and emotional response with supernatural precision, making them masters of seduction and corruption who can reshape entire civilizations according to their desires. Beyond the hierarchies of the individual gods exist entities that serve chaos as a unified force rather than pledging allegiance to specific deities. These undivided demons draw power from the fundamental nature of chaos itself, their existence depending on the overall strength of warp influence rather than the dominance of particular gods. Their forms and abilities reflect the chaotic nature of the Immaterium without the focused characteristics that define God-specific entities. Furies represent the most common form of undivided demon, manifesting as winged humanoids whose forms combine elements from multiple chaos gods without achieving the focused power of dedicated servants. These entities appear as skeletal figures with tattered wings and claws capable of rending flesh, their presence generating an aura of malevolence that affects all nearby creatures regardless of their allegiances. Furies serve as scouts and messengers for more powerful demons while providing harassment capabilities that complement the specialized abilities of God-specific forces. The flight capabilities of Furies make them valuable assets for reconnaissance and rapid deployment operations, allowing Chaos forces to gather intelligence about enemy positions while delivering targeted strikes against vulnerable targets. These demons can traverse both real space and the warp with equal facility, making them ideal for coordinating operations that span multiple dimensions. Their relatively simple nature means they can be summoned with less psychic energy than more specialized entities, making them cost-effective additions to any demonic incursion. Chaos Spawn represent the ultimate fate of mortals whose bodies cannot withstand the transformative power of chaos corruption, their forms serving as warnings about the dangers of uncontrolled mutation. These entities appear as writhing masses of flesh that incorporate random body parts from multiple species, their structure changing constantly as competing genetic patterns struggle for dominance. Spawn possess no rational intelligence, but retain enough instinct to function as living weapons that attack any target their handlers designate. The unpredictable nature of Spawn mutations makes each entity unique in terms of capabilities and weaknesses, with some developing enhanced strength while others gain additional sensory organs or defensive adaptations. This variability makes them difficult for enemies to prepare against, as tactics that prove effective against one spawn might fail completely against another. Their presence on battlefields serves both tactical and psychological purposes, as their horrific appearance demonstrates the consequences of resisting chaos, while their combat effectiveness provides genuine military value. The creation of Spawn occurs when individuals exposed to chaos corruption undergo mutations that exceed their body's ability to maintain biological coherence. This process typically affects those who attempt to gain power from multiple chaos gods simultaneously, as the conflicting influences create genetic instabilities that prevent stable transformation. The resulting entities retain fragments of their original memories, but lack the cognitive capacity to access this information coherently, creating beings that exist in perpetual states of confusion and rage. The dimensional barriers separating the Materium from the Immaterium remain stable across most regions of the galaxy, maintained by the natural resistance that physical reality offers against psychic intrusion. However, certain catastrophic events can tear these barriers apart, creating permanent rifts where warp energy flows freely into real space. These phenomena, known as warp storms, represent some of the most dangerous threats facing galactic civilization, transforming entire sectors into hellscapes where the laws of physics become meaningless and demonic entities roam freely across worlds that once supported human life. The largest and most significant of these reality wounds dominates the galaxy's northwestern regions, a massive tear in space-time that has persisted for 10,000 years since its violent creation. The Eye of Terror stretches across approximately 20,000 light-years of space, encompassing hundreds of star systems within its boundaries, where the warp and material universe exist in constant overlap. Within this zone, the normal progression of time becomes meaningless as past and future events occur simultaneously, while the thoughts and emotions of conscious beings achieve physical substance that reshapes local reality according to their psychological states. The Eye of Terror originated during the cataclysmic birth of Slaanesh in the 30th millennium, when the psychic implosion accompanying the Dark Prince's emergence from accumulated Eldar excess tore a permanent hole between dimensions. The newborn god's first scream of consciousness shattered the barriers separating the Materium from the Immaterium across vast regions of space, creating a wound in reality that consumed the heart of the ancient Eldar Empire. The psychic shockwave killed billions of Eldar instantly as their souls were torn from their bodies and devoured by Slaanesh's insatiable hunger, while entire worlds simply ceased to exist as their matter was transformed into psychic energy. The creation of this massive warp rift fundamentally altered the strategic balance of galactic power by providing chaos forces with a permanent staging ground from which to launch attacks against the material universe. Unlike temporary warp storms that eventually dissipate as the psychic energies sustaining them are exhausted, the Eye of Terror draws continuous power from the four Chaos Gods, whose combined influence maintains the dimensional breach regardless of external conditions. This stability allows demon armies to mass within the Eye's boundaries, without the usual limitations that constrain their manifestation in real space. The interior of the Eye of Terror operates according to warp logic rather than physical laws, creating an environment where belief shapes reality and emotion manifests as tangible force. Demon worlds within the rift reflect the nature of their ruling entities, with Khornate planets becoming endless battlefields of brass and blood, while Nurglite worlds transform into diseased gardens where corruption blooms like vegetation. Tzeentchian domains shift constantly between different configurations as their masters' whims alter local geography, while Slaaneshi territories achieve impossible beauty that conceals predatory dangers beneath aesthetic perfection. The Eye serves as the primary base of operations for the Traitor Legions, whose fortress worlds within the Rift provide staging areas for Black Crusades against the Imperium. These Space Marine forces, corrupted during the Horus Heresy 10 millennia ago, have established domains that reflect their patron god's influence, while maintaining enough stability to support large-scale military operations. The Iron Warriors construct siege fortresses from living metal that adapts to resist any attack, while the Emperor's children build palaces dedicated to the pursuit of perfect sensation through increasingly extreme experiences. Navigation within the Eye of Terror requires specialized knowledge of warp currents and demonic politics, as traditional astrogation methods become useless in an environment where space and time follow symbolic rather than mathematical relationships. Chaos navigators who guide void ships through the Eye's interior must negotiate with demon entities that control local passage routes, offering tribute or service in exchange for safe conduct. These bargains often carry hidden costs that only become apparent after the ships have reached their destinations, with crews discovering that their vessels have been subtly corrupted or their mission parameters have changed according to demonic whims. The Eye's influence extends beyond its visible boundaries through psychic emanations that affect neighboring star systems, creating zones of instability where reality becomes increasingly malleable. Worlds within several hundred light-years of the Eye experience higher rates of mutation and psychic awakening among their populations, while their warp travel routes become increasingly dangerous as demon entities use the rift's proximity to project their influence into nearby regions. These buffer zones serve as early warning systems for Imperial forces, while providing chaos cults with enhanced access to their patron deity's power. Imperial efforts to contain the Eye of Terror focus on maintaining the Cadian Gate, a stable corridor of real space that provides the only reliable route for large-scale military forces to approach the Rift's boundaries. The fortress world of Cadia served for millennia as the primary bulwark against chaos expansion, its massive defensive installations and veteran garrison forces preventing demon armies from breaking out into the broader Imperium. The world's strategic position allowed Imperial commanders to monitor chaos activity within the Eye while maintaining sufficient force concentration to respond to emerging threats. The destruction of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade fundamentally altered the strategic situation around the Eye of Terror by eliminating the primary choke point that had constrained chaos expansion for 10,000 years. The planet's annihilation created additional instabilities in local space-time that allowed the eye's influence to spread beyond its previous boundaries, creating new warp rifts that connected the original tier to other regions of the galaxy. This expansion enabled chaos forces to launch coordinated attacks across multiple sectors simultaneously, while reducing the Imperium's ability to predict and counter their movements. Beyond the Eye of Terror, numerous smaller warp storms plagued different regions of the galaxy, each creating localized zones where demon incursions become possible and normal space travel proves impossible. The Maelstrom represents the second largest of these phenomena, a massive warp rift located in the galaxy's western regions that has persisted for thousands of years, despite periodic Imperial efforts to seal or contain it. This storm system encompasses several dozen star systems within its primary boundaries, while generating secondary disturbances that affect navigation and communication across entire sectors. The Maelstrom originated from accumulated psychic trauma generated by massive conflicts during the Age of Strife, when human colony worlds throughout the region engaged in devastating wars that killed billions while generating enormous psychic emanations of rage, despair, and hatred. These emotional currents eventually reached critical mass and tore open a permanent rift between dimensions, creating a smaller but still significant wound in reality that provides chaos forces with another staging ground for attacks against Imperial territory. Unlike the Eye of Terror's relatively stable configuration, the Maelstrom exhibits cyclical behavior that causes its boundaries to expand and contract according to patterns that correlate with galactic events and local psychic disturbances. During periods of increased warfare or civil unrest in surrounding sectors, the storm system draws additional power from the resulting emotional emanations and expands its area of influence. Conversely, extended periods of peace and stability in nearby regions cause the Maelstrom to contract as its psychic fuel sources diminish. The interior of the Maelstrom contains fewer stable demon worlds than the Eye of Terror, but supports larger populations of Chaos Space Marines and renegade Imperial forces who use the storm's protection to launch piratical raids against nearby systems. These raiders exploit the Maelstrom's cyclical nature by timing their attacks to coincide with periods of maximum expansion, when the storm's influence extends furthest into real space and provides them with enhanced psychic support for their operations. The Hadex anomaly represents another significant warp rift that affects the galaxy's eastern regions, though its origins differ from the massive tiers created by divine births or accumulated psychic trauma. This phenomenon resulted from failed attempts by the Adeptus Mechanicus to create artificial warp routes during the Great Crusade, when tech adepts sought to establish stable corridors that would allow faster travel between distant Forge worlds. The experimental procedures involved manipulating fundamental forces that the Mechanicus only partially understood, leading to catastrophic failures that tore holes in local space-time. The Hadex anomaly exhibits unique characteristics that distinguish it from naturally occurring warp storms, including temporal distortions that cause ships entering the rift to emerge at their destinations before they departed or decades after their intended arrival times. These chronological anomalies make the region extremely dangerous for navigation, while creating opportunities for chaos forces to coordinate attacks across multiple time periods simultaneously. Imperial forces attempting to respond to raids emerging from the Hadex anomaly often find themselves fighting enemies who possess foreknowledge of their tactical plans. Smaller warp rifts appear throughout the galaxy with disturbing frequency, their formation triggered by various catastrophic events that generate sufficient psychic energy to tear holes between dimensions. Planetary civil wars that kill billions of civilians can create localized storms that persist for decades, while the destruction of major hive cities sometimes generates rifts large enough to allow demon incursions. These minor tiers typically remain active for limited periods before the psychic energies sustaining them dissipate, but their temporary existence can cause devastating damage to local populations. The formation of new warp storms follows patterns that correlate with galactic events and the overall level of psychic disturbance throughout human space. Major conflicts like the Horus Heresy or Tyranid invasions generate widespread emotional trauma that increases the likelihood of reality tears appearing in affected regions. Similarly, the awakening of powerful psychers or the discovery of ancient xenotech artifacts can create localized instabilities that eventually develop into full-scale warp storms if not contained quickly. Warp storms disrupt astropathic communication across vast regions of space by interfering with the psychic signals that enable faster-than-light messaging between star systems. The chaotic energies emanating from these rifts create interference patterns that scramble telepathic transmissions while attracting demon entities that prey upon unprotected astropaths. Communication networks that depend on psychic relay stations find their effectiveness severely compromised when storms appear along their transmission routes, forcing Imperial commanders to rely on slower physical courier services or risk exposing their astropaths to demonic attack. The interference effects extend beyond simple signal disruption to encompass more subtle forms of corruption that can compromise the content of messages transmitted through storm-affected regions. Demon entities within the rifts sometimes intercept astropathic communications and alter their content before allowing them to continue to their destinations, creating false intelligence that leads Imperial forces into carefully prepared ambushes. These manipulations prove particularly dangerous because they exploit the Imperium's dependence on psychic communication while remaining virtually undetectable until their effects become apparent through operational failures. Warp travel becomes impossible within the boundaries of active storm systems because the chaotic energies prevent navigators from perceiving the astronomicon or other reference points necessary for safe passage through the Immaterium. Ships attempting to enter warp storms either fail to translate from real space entirely or emerge in random locations thousands of light years from their intended destinations. Those vessels that do manage to enter storm-affected regions of the warp often encounter demon entities that board their ships during transit, leading to possession of crew members or corruption of the vessel's machine spirit. The cyclical nature of warp storm activity creates patterns that experienced Imperial commanders learn to recognize and exploit for strategic advantage. Storm systems typically exhibit periods of maximum intensity followed by gradual decline as their psychic fuel sources are exhausted, creating windows of opportunity when limited travel through affected regions becomes possible. These quiet periods rarely last long enough for major fleet movements, but can allow small, fast vessels to carry urgent messages or supplies through otherwise impassable areas. The correlation between warp storm activity and galactic events provides Imperial strategists with early warning indicators of potential threats, as increased storm formation often precedes major chaos offensives or other catastrophic events. Intelligence analysts monitor storm patterns across multiple sectors to identify regions where psychic disturbances suggest impending conflicts or the emergence of new threats. This monitoring requires extensive coordination between different Imperial agencies and relies heavily on astropathic reports from worlds near active storm systems. Mass casualty events generate psychic emanations that can trigger the formation of new warp storms or strengthen existing ones, creating feedback loops where violence breeds additional instability that enables further violence. Planetary bombardments that kill billions of civilians release enormous quantities of psychic energy into the warp, potentially creating rifts that allow demon armies to invade neighboring systems. This relationship between death and dimensional instability makes certain military tactics extremely dangerous, as their immediate tactical benefits might be outweighed by the long-term strategic costs of creating new chaos strongholds. The Imperium's response to warp storm threats involves multiple specialized organizations working in coordination to monitor, contain, and when possible eliminate these reality tiers before they can establish permanent footholds in real space. The Ordo Malleus maintains extensive databases tracking storm activity across the galaxy, while deploying Grey Knights and other demon hunting specialists to investigate new phenomena. The Imperial Navy establishes quarantine zones around active storms to prevent civilian vessels from entering dangerous areas while maintaining patrol routes that can respond quickly to emerging threats. Attempts to artificially close warp storms require enormous expenditures of resources and often result in casualties that exceed those caused by allowing the rifts to dissipate naturally. The most successful closure operations involve coordinated strikes by multiple Space Marine chapters supported by massive Imperial Guard formations and specialized Mechanicus technology, but even these efforts frequently fail due to the unpredictable nature of warp phenomena. The risks associated with closure attempts mean that Imperial commanders often choose to contain storms rather than eliminate them, accepting the long-term threat in exchange for avoiding immediate catastrophic losses. The catastrophic reality wounds that plague the galaxy pale in comparison to the ultimate betrayal that transformed the Emperor's greatest warriors into instruments of chaos corruption. The Horus Heresy stands as the pivotal moment when half of the Space Marine legions abandoned their oaths of loyalty and embraced the dark powers of the warp, creating a schism that would define galactic warfare for the next 10 millennia. This civil war did not emerge from sudden madness, but developed through careful corruption that exploited the character flaws and psychological vulnerabilities of the Primarchs who led these superhuman forces. The Emperor's children represented the First Legion to fall completely to chaos influence, their corruption beginning during the Great Crusade when they encountered the alien blade known as the Lair weapon on the world of Laren. Fulgrim's discovery and subsequent wielding of this Xenos artifact marked the beginning of his gradual descent into the worship of Slaanesh, though the Primarch remained unaware of his spiritual corruption for many months. The demon bound within the weapon slowly influenced Fulgrim's thoughts and actions, amplifying his existing obsession with perfection while introducing new desires for increasingly extreme experiences. The Legion's transformation reflected their Primarch's character flaws magnified to catastrophic proportions. Fulgrim's pursuit of excellence in all endeavors had always bordered on obsession, but under demonic influence, this drive became a compulsive need to experience sensations beyond mortal comprehension. His Space Marines followed their Gene Father's example, gradually abandoning their original mission of bringing compliance to human worlds in favor of pursuing perfect experiences through increasingly depraved acts. By the time of the Istvan III atrocity, the Emperor's children had become willing servants of the Dark Prince, their purple and gold armor bearing the marks of corruption as they slaughtered loyalist forces with weapons designed to inflict maximum pain rather than clean death. The Iron Warriors' fall to chaos stemmed from different psychological foundations, rooted in their Primarch Perturabo's deep-seated resentment toward his brothers and the Emperor's apparent lack of appreciation for his Legion's sacrifices. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Fourth Legion had been assigned the most thankless tasks: siege warfare, garrison duty, and the systematic reduction of heavily fortified positions that other legions avoided. While their brothers earned glory through dramatic victories and heroic charges, the Iron Warriors ground down enemy resistance through methodical application of overwhelming firepower and engineering expertise. Perturabo's bitterness grew with each campaign as he watched Primarchs like Horus and Sanguinius receive accolades for achievements that the Iron Warriors' Primarch considered inferior to his own accomplishments. The systematic destruction of fortified positions required greater technical skill than open battle, yet the Emperor seemed to value dramatic gestures over practical results. This resentment created psychological vulnerabilities that chaos could exploit, particularly when Horus began his rebellion and offered Perturabo the recognition and authority he felt he deserved. The Iron Warriors' corruption manifested through their increasing willingness to employ forbidden technologies and accept casualties that exceeded all reasonable limits. Their siege warfare evolved from precise application of force into grinding attrition campaigns that consumed entire populations while testing new weapons of mass destruction. Perturabo's obsession with proving his superiority over his brothers led him to accept demonic assistance in constructing siege engines and fortifications, gradually binding his legion to the service of chaos, undivided rather than any specific god. The Night Lord's descent into chaos differed from other legions because their Primarch Conrad Kurz had never fully embraced the Emperor's vision of galactic unity and human enlightenment. Raised on the crime-ridden world of Nostromo, Kurz had learned that fear represented the most effective tool for maintaining order among populations that refused to accept rational governance. His methods of bringing compliance to rebel worlds involved systematic terror campaigns that left entire populations traumatized but obedient, techniques that achieved rapid results while generating enormous psychological damage. Kurz's precognitive abilities allowed him to perceive potential futures with disturbing clarity, including visions of his own death and the eventual corruption of his legion. These prophetic insights created a fatalistic worldview that viewed the Horus Heresy as inevitable rather than preventable, leading the Night Haunter to embrace his role as an agent of destruction rather than attempting to prevent the coming catastrophe. His Space Marines adopted their Primarch's nihilistic philosophy, gradually abandoning any pretense of serving the Imperium's ideals in favor of pursuing personal vendettas and inflicting terror for its own sake. The 8th Legion's corruption proceeded through the gradual abandonment of military discipline in favor of predatory behavior that reflected their recruitment from Nostromo's criminal underclass. Night Lord's companies began operating as independent terror cells that targeted civilian populations rather than military objectives, their campaigns designed to generate maximum fear rather than achieve strategic goals. By the time of the Heresy, the Legion had effectively dissolved into numerous warbands that maintained only nominal allegiance to their Primarch, while pursuing individual agendas focused on spreading terror throughout human space. The World Eater's fall represented perhaps the most tragic corruption among the traitor legions, as their transformation into mindless berserkers destroyed the tactical intelligence and strategic thinking that had once made them effective warriors. Angron's implantation of the Butcher's nails into his Space Marines' brains began as an attempt to share his own suffering with his Gene sons, but the cybernetic implants gradually eroded their capacity for rational thought while amplifying their aggressive instincts beyond all control. The nails operated by stimulating the brain's pleasure centers during moments of violence while causing excruciating pain during periods of calm, creating psychological conditioning that made combat the only relief from constant agony. World Eaters equipped with these devices found themselves unable to function in normal social situations, their enhanced neurochemistry driving them to seek increasingly violent outlets for their artificial rage. The Legion's tactical doctrine evolved from disciplined assault operations into frenzied charges that prioritized killing over strategic objectives. Angron's ascension to demonhood during the Heresy completed his Legion's transformation into servants of Khorne, though this corruption had been building for decades through their use of the Butcher's nails. The World Eater's worship of the Blood God emerged naturally from their artificial conditioning rather than through deliberate conversion, as the cybernetic implants created psychological states that perfectly matched Khorne's preferences for rage-fueled combat. By the Siege of Terra, the 12th Legion had become little more than a rabid pack that required constant direction from other traitor forces to remain focused on military objectives. The Death Guard's corruption developed through their Primarch Mortarian's complex relationship with the concept of endurance and his deep-seated hatred of psychers and sorcery. Throughout the Great Crusade, the 14th Legion had specialized in warfare under the most hostile conditions imaginable, their enhanced physiology allowing them to fight effectively in toxic atmospheres and irradiated environments that would kill normal humans instantly. This specialization created a culture that valued stoic acceptance of hardship while viewing easy victories with suspicion. Mortarian's fall occurred during the Heresy when his fleet became trapped in the warp by demonic influence, their ships becalmed in regions where the Immaterium's chaotic energies created supernatural plagues that even Space Marine physiology could not resist. The Death Guard found themselves dying slowly from diseases that defied all medical treatment, while their Primarch proved unable to navigate them to safety. In desperation, Mortarion accepted Nurgle's offer of salvation, trading his Legion's souls for relief from suffering that had become unbearable. The transformation of the Death Guard into Plague Marines reflected Nurgle's gifts of supernatural resilience and freedom from pain, but these blessings came at the cost of their humanity and physical integrity. The Legion's power armor became fused with their corrupted flesh, while their bodies served as breeding grounds for supernatural diseases that they spread to enemy forces through combat. Their tactical doctrine shifted from endurance-based warfare to the systematic corruption of enemy positions through biological and chemical weapons that reflected their patron god's domain. The Thousand Sons' damnation emerged from their Primarch Magnus's pursuit of psychic knowledge and his belief that the Emperor's warnings about the dangers of sorcery were unnecessarily restrictive. The 15th Legion had always contained high proportions of psychers among their ranks, their recruitment practices favoring individuals with strong psychic potential over purely physical capabilities. This emphasis on sorcerous power created a culture that viewed the mastery of warp energies as the highest form of human achievement. Magnus's attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption through psychic communication resulted in the catastrophic breach of the Imperial Palace's psychic defenses and the destruction of the Human Webway project. This well-intentioned but disastrous intervention led to the Space Wolves' assault on Prospero, forcing the Thousand Sons to defend themselves against fellow Space Marines who had been ordered to bring them to Terra for judgment. The destruction of their homeworld and the apparent betrayal by the Emperor they had sought to serve drove Magnus and his Legion into alliance with Tzeentch. The Thousand Sons' transformation into dust-filled automata occurred when Ahriman cast the rubric spell in an attempt to halt the rampant mutations that were consuming his battle brothers. The sorceress working succeeded in stabilizing the Legion's physical forms, but at the cost of trapping their souls within their power armor while reducing their bodies to dust. Only the most powerful sorcerers retained their original forms, becoming the leaders of companies filled with silent warriors whose consciousness existed in a state between life and death. The Sons of Horus represented the most significant betrayal because their Primarch Horus had been the Emperor's most trusted son, and the War Master chosen to lead the Great Crusade during the Master of Mankind's absence. Horus's corruption began on the world of Davin when he was mortally wounded by a weapon tainted with chaos influence, forcing his subordinates to seek healing through rituals that exposed the Primarch to direct demonic manipulation. The entities that saved Horus's life also implanted visions and suggestions that gradually turned him against his father. The 16th Legion's fall reflected their absolute loyalty to their Primarch rather than any inherent corruption within their ranks. When Horus declared his rebellion against the Emperor, the vast majority of his Space Marines followed without question, their gene-programmed devotion to their father overriding their oaths to the throne. The Legion's transformation from the Emperor's chosen warriors into the Black Legion occurred gradually over the millennia following the heresy, as their failures and losses forced them to accept recruits from other traitor legions and renegade chapters. The Word-Bearers' corruption predated the Horus heresy by several decades, making them the first legion to embrace chaos worship through deliberate choice rather than gradual corruption or desperate circumstances. Lorgar's search for divine truth had led him to reject the Imperial Truth's atheistic philosophy in favor of worshipping the Emperor as a god, a practice that earned his Legion's censure and humiliation at the hands of the Ultramarines. This public rebuke drove Lorgar to seek other objects of veneration, eventually leading him to discover the Chaos Gods through the manipulations of Khor Pharaon and Erebus. The 17th Legion's role as the primary architects of the Horus heresy reflected their decades of preparation and their understanding of chaos corruption that exceeded that of any other traitor force. Word-Bearers' chaplains had spent years infiltrating other legions and establishing cult cells that could be activated when the rebellion began, their religious fervor providing them with the patience necessary for long-term subversion operations. the Legion's tactical doctrine emphasized the corruption of enemy forces through psychological warfare and the summoning of demonic allies rather than relying purely on conventional military strength. The Alpha Legion's relationship with chaos corruption remains the most ambiguous among all the traitor legions, as their complex schemes and divided loyalties make their true motivations impossible to determine with certainty. Alfarius and Omgon's encounter with the Cabal and their subsequent decision to support Horus's rebellion may have been motivated by genuine belief that the War Master's victory would ultimately serve humanity's interests by allowing chaos to burn itself out through rapid conquest rather than prolonged corruption. The 20th Legion's operational methods emphasized deception and infiltration over direct confrontation, their campaigns designed to achieve strategic objectives through minimal application of force. This approach continued after their apparent betrayal, with Alpha Legion cells operating throughout Imperial space in pursuit of goals that might serve either Chaos or Imperial interests, depending on circumstances that remain hidden from outside observers. Their corruption, if it exists at all, manifests through their willingness to employ any means necessary to achieve their objectives rather than through obvious signs of demonic influence. The long war that followed the Traitor Legion's defeat during the Siege of Terra has continued for 10,000 years, as these corrupted Space Marines launch endless campaigns against the Imperium from their strongholds within the Eye of Terror and other warp storms. The Black Crusades represent the largest and most coordinated of these attacks, massive invasions that combine the resources of multiple traitor legions under the leadership of Abaddon the Despoiler, who has gradually united the fractious forces of chaos through a combination of military success and political manipulation. Each Black Crusade has targeted specific strategic objectives rather than attempting the total conquest that characterized the original heresy, with Abaddon's forces seeking to capture key worlds, artifacts, or individuals that advance his long-term plans for the Imperium's destruction. The 13th Black Crusade's success in destroying Cadia and expanding the Eye of Terror represents the culmination of millennia of preparation, creating new opportunities for chaos expansion, while demonstrating that the traitor legions remain capable of achieving strategic victories despite their internal divisions and resource limitations. The traitor legion's current state reflects 10 millennia of warfare, corruption, and gradual transformation into something far removed from their original nature as the Emperor's chosen warriors. Their recruitment practices now draw from a galaxy-wide network of chaos cults and renegade Imperial forces, creating mixed companies that combine veterans of the original legions with newer converts who bring different skills and perspectives to their eternal war against the Imperium they once served. The corruption that flows from the warp into the material universe requires mortal agents to achieve its full potential, as even the most powerful demons cannot maintain permanent presence in real space without anchors provided by living souls pledged to their service. Chaos cults represent the primary mechanism through which the dark gods extend their influence throughout human space, creating networks of corrupted individuals who work tirelessly to advance their patron deities' agendas while remaining hidden among loyal Imperial citizens. These organizations operate at every level of society, from desperate underhive gangers seeking power through forbidden rituals to high-ranking officials who use their positions to orchestrate planetary-scale corruption campaigns. The formation of chaos cults follows predictable patterns that exploit fundamental weaknesses in human psychology and Imperial society. Most cults begin when individuals facing desperate circumstances encounter forbidden knowledge that promises solutions to their problems through the worship of entities they do not fully understand. A factory worker dying from industrial toxins might discover texts describing Nurgle's gifts of freedom from pain, while an ambitious clerk overlooked for promotion could learn about Tzeentch's favor for those who demonstrate proper cunning and planning. These initial contacts rarely reveal the true nature of chaos worship, instead presenting the dark gods as benevolent entities who who reward faithful service. The recruitment process operates through careful psychological manipulation designed to gradually erode the target's loyalty to the Imperium while building dependence on the cult's support structure. New members receive small favors and assistance with their problems, creating obligations that the cult later exploits to demand increasingly significant acts of devotion. A Khornate cult might begin by helping a gang member win fights through superior weapons and training, then gradually escalate their demands until the recruit participates in ritual murders that bind them irrevocably to their patron's service. Chaos cults maintain operational security through cellular organization that limits individual members' knowledge of the broader organization while providing multiple layers of protection against Imperial investigation. Most cultists know only their immediate superiors and subordinates, receiving orders through coded messages or symbolic communications that appear innocuous to outside observers. This compartmentalization ensures that the capture of individual cells does not compromise entire networks, while the use of legitimate businesses and social organizations as cover provides cultists with plausible explanations for their regular meetings and activities. The most successful cults establish themselves within existing Imperial institutions, using their members' legitimate positions to gather intelligence, influence policy decisions, and provide protection for their illegal activities. A cult that places members within the Adeptus Archives can receive advance warning of investigations while steering law enforcement attention away from their operations. Similarly, cultists within the Imperial Guard can arrange for weapons and equipment to be diverted to their organization, while ensuring that military responses to their activities remain inadequate or misdirected. Cults dedicated to Khorne typically recruit from populations already familiar with violence, drawing their membership from military veterans, gang members, gladiatorial fighters, and others whose experience with combat makes them receptive to the blood god's message of strength through warfare. These organizations often masquerade as martial arts schools, veterans associations, or honor societies that emphasize the nobility of combat while gradually introducing members to increasingly extreme interpretations of warrior philosophy. Khornate recruitment emphasizes personal empowerment through the development of fighting skills, appealing to individuals who feel powerless in their daily lives but discover confidence through mastery of weapons and combat techniques. The rituals practiced by Khornate cults center around combat training and ceremonial duels that frequently result in death, with the spilled blood serving as offerings to their patron deity. These ceremonies often take place in hidden arenas constructed beneath legitimate businesses or within abandoned industrial facilities, their floors stained with the blood of countless participants who have fought and died for their god's approval. The cults maintain extensive armories filled with weapons from across the galaxy, viewing the collection and mastery of different fighting styles as acts of religious devotion that demonstrate their commitment to martial excellence. Khornate corruption spreads through these organizations by amplifying existing aggressive tendencies while providing philosophical justification for increasingly violent behavior. Members learn to view every conflict as an opportunity to honor their god through displays of courage and skill, gradually losing the ability to resolve disputes through negotiation or compromise. The cult's influence extends beyond their formal membership through the families and associates of active cultists, who find themselves drawn into cycles of violence that reflect the blood god's preferences for direct confrontation over subtle manipulation. The military doctrine of Khornate cults emphasizes frontal assault and close combat over ranged warfare or defensive tactics, reflecting their patrons' hatred of cowardice and preference for honorable battle. Cult warriors charge into combat with melee weapons while eschewing heavy armor or defensive positions, their tactics designed to generate maximum bloodshed regardless of strategic considerations. These organizations often struggle with long-term planning because their members' conditioning drives them to seek immediate violent solutions rather than developing complex schemes that might achieve better results through patience and subtlety. Tzeentchian cults operate through entirely different methods, drawing their membership from educated populations who possess both the intellectual capacity to understand their patrons' complex teachings and the ambition necessary to implement them effectively. These organizations recruit heavily from academic institutions, government bureaucracies, and commercial enterprises, where their members can access information and influence policy decisions that serve the changer of ways agenda. Tzeentchian corruption appeals particularly to individuals who feel that their intelligence and capabilities are underappreciated by their superiors or society in general. The recruitment techniques employed by Tzeentchian cults emphasize intellectual stimulation and the promise of hidden knowledge that will unlock the recruit's true potential. These organizations often present themselves as philosophical societies, research groups, or professional associations that offer advanced training in specialized subjects. New members receive access to libraries filled with forbidden texts while participating in discussions that gradually introduce them to increasingly dangerous forms of knowledge. The cult's teaching methods combine legitimate scholarship with heretical concepts, making it difficult for recruits to identify the point at which their studies cross into outright corruption. Tzeentchian rituals involve complex ceremonies that serve multiple purposes simultaneously, advancing the cult's political objectives while providing psychic sustenance to their patron deity. These rituals often incorporate mathematical formulas, astrological calculations, and symbolic manipulations that require extensive preparation and precise execution. The ceremonies take place in hidden chambers decorated with ever-changing patterns that reflect the changer of ways mastery over mutation and transformation, their walls covered with equations and diagrams that hurt the minds of those who lack proper preparation to comprehend them. The political activities of Tzeentchian cults operate across timescales that dwarf normal human planning, with individual schemes requiring decades or centuries to reach fruition. These organizations work to place their members in positions of authority throughout imperial institutions, while orchestrating complex sequences of events that gradually reshape entire sectors according to their patrons' desires. A single cult might simultaneously work to trigger a trade war between competing merchant houses, influence the selection of a new planetary governor, and arrange for the discovery of archaeotech artifacts that will advance their understanding of forbidden sciences. The corruption spread by Tzeentchian cults manifests through the gradual erosion of institutional integrity as their members use their positions to advance personal agendas rather than serving the Imperium's interests. Government agencies infiltrated by these organizations develop Byzantine bureaucratic procedures that serve the cult's purposes while appearing to maintain normal function. Academic institutions under Tzeentchian influence gradually shift their curricula toward subjects that prepare students for eventual recruitment while producing research that advances the cult's understanding of psychic phenomena and warp manipulation. Nurglite cults emerge from populations that have experienced significant suffering, loss, or exposure to disease, their recruitment focusing on individuals who have learned to accept hardship as an inevitable part of existence. These organizations often develop within refugee camps, plague-stricken communities, or industrial zones where workers face constant exposure to toxic substances that cause chronic illness and premature death. Nurglite corruption appeals to people who have exhausted conventional sources of hope and find comfort in the Plague Father's teachings about the natural cycle of decay and renewal. The recruitment methods of Nurglite cults emphasize compassion and mutual support, with established members providing genuine assistance to newcomers who face medical problems, financial difficulties, or social isolation. These organizations operate extensive networks of healers, counselors, and community organizers who offer services that legitimate imperial institutions often fail to provide. The cult's medical practices combine effective treatments for common ailments with subtle exposure to supernatural diseases that gradually transform recipients into willing servants of decay. Nurglite rituals involve the cultivation and sharing of sacred diseases that serve as sacraments connecting the faithful to their patron deity. These ceremonies take place in hidden gardens, where supernatural plagues bloom like flowers, their participants sharing infections through ritual contact that creates bonds of fellowship based on shared corruption. The diseases spread by these cults operate according to principles that defy medical understanding, creating symbiotic relationships between host and pathogen that benefit both parties, while gradually transforming the infected into living extensions of Nurgle's will. The social services provided by Nurglite cults create dependencies that the organizations exploit to expand their influence throughout affected communities. Families who rely on cult healers for medical care find themselves gradually exposed to the Plague Father's gifts, while individuals who receive financial assistance during times of crisis discover that their benefactors expect increasingly significant acts of devotion in return. The cult's charitable activities provide them with legitimate cover for their illegal operations, while generating genuine gratitude from recipients who view the organizations as essential sources of support. Nurglite corruption spreads through affected populations by transforming their understanding of disease and death from sources of fear into objects of acceptance and even celebration. Communities under the Plague Father's influence develop cultural practices that incorporate ritual exposure to beneficial diseases while viewing medical intervention as interference with natural processes. These populations often exhibit supernatural resistance to conventional plagues while serving as breeding grounds for new strains of supernatural disease that the cults can spread to neighboring regions. Slaaneshi cults recruit from populations that have achieved sufficient prosperity and security to pursue aesthetic and sensory experiences beyond basic survival needs, their membership drawn primarily from the cultural elite who possess both the resources and the sophistication necessary to appreciate the Dark Prince's gifts. These organizations often masquerade as artistic societies, exclusive social clubs, or cultural institutions that sponsor legitimate creative activities while gradually introducing participants to increasingly extreme forms of sensory exploration. The recruitment techniques employed by Slaaneshi cults emphasize the pursuit of perfection and the exploration of new forms of experience that transcend conventional limitations. These organizations attract artists, performers, intellectuals, and wealthy dilettantes who seek to distinguish themselves through participation in exclusive activities that demonstrate their superior taste and sophistication. The cult's initial offerings appear entirely legitimate, consisting of private exhibitions, intimate concerts, and philosophical discussions that gradually introduce participants to more dangerous forms of aesthetic exploration. Slaaneshi rituals combine artistic performance with sensory experiences designed to overwhelm participants' normal psychological defenses while creating states of euphoric receptivity to their patron's influence. These ceremonies take place in hidden chambers decorated with masterpieces that induce powerful emotional responses, their participants engaging in activities that blur the boundaries between art and sensation. The rituals often incorporate music, visual displays, and chemical substances that directly stimulate the nervous system while creating psychological dependencies that bind participants to the cult's activities. The cultural activities sponsored by Slaaneshi cults serve to identify potential recruits while gradually corrupting local artistic communities through the introduction of increasingly extreme aesthetic concepts. These organizations fund galleries, theaters, and performance venues that present works designed to push the boundaries of acceptable expression while normalizing concepts that serve the Dark Prince's agenda. The cult's patronage creates economic dependencies that make artists reluctant to reject commissions even when they recognize the dangerous nature of their sponsors' requests. Slaaneshi corruption manifests through the transformation of legitimate artistic pursuits into vehicles for spreading the cult's influence, with cultural works that appear beautiful and sophisticated containing subtle elements that stimulate psychological responses in viewers. Communities under the Dark Prince's influence develop increasingly decadent cultural practices that prioritize sensation over meaning, while creating social pressures that encourage participation in ever more extreme activities. The corruption spreads through social networks as individuals compete to demonstrate their sophistication through participation in exclusive experiences that gradually erode their moral boundaries. The leadership structure of chaos cults reflects the hierarchical nature of their patron deities, while providing the organizational framework necessary to coordinate complex operations across multiple worlds and sectors. At the apex of most cult organizations stand dark apostles, corrupted individuals who serve as direct conduits for their chosen god's will, while possessing the charisma and intelligence necessary to maintain large networks of devoted followers. These leaders often began their careers as legitimate imperial clergy, military officers, or government officials, whose positions provided them with the authority and resources needed to establish extensive cult networks. Dark apostles undergo gradual transformation through decades of exposure to warp energies and demonic influence, their bodies and minds adapting to serve as vessels for their patron deity's power. These changes grant them supernatural abilities that exceed normal human limitations, while marking them as obviously corrupted to anyone with sufficient knowledge to recognize the signs. Khornate Dark Apostles develop enhanced physical strength and resistance to injury that allows them to survive wounds that would kill normal humans, while their presence inspires berserker fury in their followers during combat situations. Tzeentchian Dark Apostles gain access to sorcerous knowledge that allows them to manipulate probability and alter local reality within limited parameters, their understanding of warp dynamics exceeding that of many sanctioned psychers. These leaders often appear as scholarly individuals whose extensive learning conceals the heretical nature of their studies, their conversations revealing intimate knowledge of subjects that should be forbidden to imperial citizens. Their corruption manifests through subtle mutations that enhance their intellectual capabilities, while gradually transforming their appearance in ways that reflect their patron's mastery over change and transformation. Nurglite Dark Apostles serve as living embodiments of their patron's gifts, their bodies hosting supernatural diseases that they can spread to others through proximity or direct contact. These leaders radiate an aura of acceptance and resignation that makes their presence oddly comforting to individuals who have experienced significant suffering, their philosophical teachings providing explanations for hardship that transform pain into spiritual achievement. Their physical corruption appears as beneficial symbiosis rather than destructive disease, with parasitic organisms that enhance their capabilities while demonstrating the Plague Father's power over life and death. Slaaneshi Dark Apostles embody their patron's pursuit of perfect sensation, their forms achieving aesthetic ideals that make them irresistibly attractive to potential followers, while concealing predatory characteristics that become apparent only during moments of crisis. These leaders possess supernatural understanding of psychology and sensory manipulation that allows them to appear as whatever their targets find most appealing, their presence creating emotional responses that bypass rational analysis and establish direct psychological dominance. Beneath the Dark Apostles in most cult hierarchies serve various specialists whose expertise enables the organization to operate effectively within imperial society while advancing their patron deity's agenda. Sorcerers provide access to forbidden knowledge and psychic abilities that allow cults to communicate across interstellar distances, manipulate local events through supernatural means, and summon demonic entities when conventional resources prove insufficient. These individuals typically possess natural psychic abilities that they have developed through heretical training rather than imperial sanctioning, their powers enhanced through pacts with warp entities that grant increased capabilities in exchange for spiritual corruption. Chaos sorcerers operate according to principles that differ fundamentally from those taught in imperial psyker training programs, their techniques emphasizing the manipulation of demonic entities rather than direct control over psychic energy. These practitioners learn to negotiate with warp beings that provide enhanced abilities in exchange for services that advance the demon's own agenda, creating symbiotic relationships that gradually transform the sorcerer into something far removed from baseline humanity. Their spells achieve effects that seem impossible to imperial observers because they operate through symbolic relationships and emotional resonance, rather than the mathematical formulas taught in sanctioned psyker academies. The corruption of Imperial psykers into chaos sorcerers represents one of the most dangerous threats facing the Imperium's psychic security apparatus, as these individuals possess intimate knowledge of Imperial procedures and capabilities that they can use to evade detection while pursuing their heretical activities. Rogue psykers who have escaped Imperial custody often gravitate toward chaos cults that offer them protection from inquisitorial pursuit while providing access to forbidden knowledge that exceeds anything available through legitimate channels. Military specialists within cult organizations provide the tactical expertise and combat training necessary to transform civilian members into effective fighting forces capable of challenging Imperial security forces during uprising situations. These individuals typically possess backgrounds in the Imperial Guard, planetary defense forces, or other military organizations that provided them with the skills necessary to organize and equip irregular forces for sustained combat operations. Their corruption often begins through exposure to chaos influence during military campaigns, particularly those involving extended combat against traitor legion forces or demon incursions. Cult military leaders work to establish hidden armories and training facilities where members can develop combat skills while maintaining the appearance of legitimate civilian activities. These installations often masquerade as sporting clubs, historical societies, or trade organizations that provide plausible explanations for the presence of weapons and the regular gathering of large groups for physical training. The military doctrine taught at these facilities emphasizes guerrilla warfare techniques and urban combat tactics that allow numerically inferior cult forces to achieve tactical advantages over better, equipped Imperial forces through superior knowledge of local terrain and civilian support networks. The infiltration of Imperial institutions by chaos cults represents perhaps the greatest long-term threat to the Imperium's stability, as corrupted officials can use their legitimate authority to advance cult agendas while appearing to serve Imperial interests. Planetary governors who fall to chaos corruption can redirect entire world's resources towards supporting cult activities while maintaining the appearance of loyal service to the throne. These individuals often begin their corruption through exposure to cult influence during their rise to power, with ambitious politicians accepting cult support in exchange for future considerations that gradually escalate into complete spiritual enslavement. The corruption of military officers poses particularly severe threats because these individuals possess the authority to deploy armed forces in support of cult activities, while having access to classified information about Imperial defensive capabilities and strategic planning. Corrupted guard commanders can arrange for their units to be deployed away from critical locations during cult uprisings, while Navy officers might provide transport for cult personnel or arrange for weapons shipments to reach cult-controlled territories. The gradual nature of most corruption means that these individuals often maintain their effectiveness as military leaders while secretly serving chaos interests. Even members of the Inquisition have proven susceptible to chaos corruption, creating security breaches that can compromise entire sectors' defensive capabilities while providing cults with advance warning of Imperial investigations. Corrupted Inquisitors possess the authority to requisition vast resources, while their rosette grants them access to information and facilities that would be impossible for normal cult agents to penetrate. These individuals often fall to corruption through prolonged exposure to chaos artifacts or entities during their investigations, their intimate knowledge of chaos threats making them valuable assets for the very forces they once fought against. The discovery and elimination of chaos cults requires specialized knowledge and resources that exceed the capabilities of normal Imperial law enforcement, as these organizations employ supernatural abilities and operate according to principles that conventional investigators cannot comprehend. The Ordo Malleus maintains extensive databases tracking cult activity across the galaxy, while deploying specialized teams trained in recognizing the subtle signs of chaos corruption. These investigations often require months or years of careful surveillance and analysis, because the cult's security measures and supernatural protection make direct confrontation extremely dangerous. The response to confirmed cult activity typically involves coordinated operations that combine the resources of multiple Imperial agencies, with inquisitorial forces providing specialized knowledge and authority, while guard units supply the manpower necessary to contain large-scale uprisings. The elimination of established cult networks often requires the sacrifice of entire populations to prevent the spread of corruption, as the supernatural diseases and psychological influences employed by these organizations can persist for generations after their leadership has been eliminated. The fortress world of Cadia stood as the Imperium's primary bulwark against chaos expansion for 10 millennia, its strategic position controlling the only stable route from the Eye of Terror into Imperial space. From this heavily fortified world, generations of Imperial commanders monitored the activities of the traitor legions while maintaining sufficient force concentrations to respond to emerging threats. The planet's destruction during the 13th Black Crusade marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in the Long War, as Abaddon the Despoiler finally achieved the strategic breakthrough that had eluded Chaos forces since their defeat at the Siege of Terra. Abaddon's rise to leadership among the fractious traitor legions required decades of careful political maneuvering and military success that gradually convinced the various Chaos factions to accept his authority. As the former first captain of the Sons of Horus, Abaddon possessed intimate knowledge of the Legion's operational procedures and strategic thinking, but his transformation into the War Master of Chaos demanded skills that exceeded those required for company-level command. The various traitor legions maintained their independence jealously, their primarchs and champions viewing any attempt at unified command as an infringement on their autonomy that required careful negotiation rather than simple orders. The political dynamics within the Eye of Terror reflected the eternal conflicts of the Great Game, with different Chaos factions aligning themselves according to their patron deities, current relationships, and strategic interests. Abaddon's genius lay in his ability to present unified action as serving each faction's individual goals rather than subordinating them to his personal ambitions. His early campaigns focused on targets that provided benefits to multiple Chaos factions simultaneously, creating precedents for cooperation that could be expanded into larger operations as trust developed between traditionally antagonistic groups. The First Black Crusade, launched in the 31st millennium, established the template for subsequent operations, combining the resources of multiple traitor legions under Abaddon's strategic direction, while allowing individual commanders to pursue their own tactical objectives within the broader campaign framework. This initial offensive targeted the fortress world of Belize Corona, whose capture would provide Chaos forces with a forward base for future operations, while demonstrating that Imperial defenses could be overcome through coordinated assault. The campaign's success proved that unified Chaos forces could achieve strategic objectives that remained beyond the reach of individual Legion operations. The selection of targets for subsequent Black Crusades reflected Abaddon's understanding that total conquest remained impossible given the Imperium's vast resources and defensive capabilities. Instead of attempting to replicate the Horus Heresy's direct assault on Terra, the War Master focused on achieving specific strategic objectives that would gradually weaken Imperial defenses while strengthening Chaos capabilities for future operations. Each crusade targeted particular worlds, artifacts, or individuals whose capture would advance the Long War's ultimate goals while providing immediate benefits to the participating Chaos factions. The Second Black Crusade focused on the capture of the fortress world of Cadia itself, recognizing that control of this strategic position would eliminate the primary chokepoint constraining Chaos expansion. However, the campaign's failure demonstrated that Imperial defenses had adapted to counter the tactics employed during the First Crusade, with reinforced fortifications and improved coordination between different Imperial agencies, preventing the breakthrough that Abaddon sought. The defeat forced the War Master to reconsider his strategic approach while providing Imperial commanders with valuable intelligence about Chaos capabilities and operational methods. Subsequent crusades adopted more sophisticated approaches that combined direct military assault with infiltration, corruption, and psychological warfare designed to weaken Imperial resistance before the main offensive began. The Fourth Black Crusade targeted the Elfaner system, where Chaos forces sought to capture ancient archaeotech facilities that could enhance their technological capabilities. The campaign employed extensive preliminary operations that placed Chaos cult cells within the system's key installations, creating internal sabotage networks that compromised Imperial defenses when the main assault commenced. The Seventh Black Crusade represented a significant escalation in scope and ambition, as Abaddon coordinated simultaneous attacks across multiple sectors to prevent Imperial forces from concentrating their defenses against any single thrust. This multi-pronged offensive targeted the Makin system, the fortress world of Makin, and several surrounding systems, whose capture would create a permanent Chaos foothold beyond the Eye of Terror's immediate vicinity. The campaign's partial success demonstrated that Imperial forces could not respond effectively to coordinated attacks across such vast distances, providing lessons that would inform future operations. The Gothic War emerged from the 12th Black Crusade's focus on capturing the ancient weapons platforms known as the Blackstone Fortresses, massive constructs of unknown origin that possessed the capability to destroy entire star systems through focused energy projection. Abaddon's recognition of these artifacts' strategic value led to a protracted campaign that combined conventional fleet actions with boarding operations designed to capture the fortresses intact rather than simply destroying them. The war's outcome provided Chaos forces with 2 functional Blackstone fortresses, while demonstrating their willingness to pursue long-term objectives despite enormous casualties. The Gothic War's opening phases caught Imperial forces unprepared for the scale and sophistication of Chaos naval operations, as Abaddon's fleets employed tactics that combined traditional void warfare with demonic summoning and reality manipulation. Chaos vessels modified with warp-touch technologies proved capable of achieving effects that conventional Imperial ships could not counter, while the presence of demon-possessed vessels created psychological pressures that affected entire fleet formations. The Imperial Navy's response required fundamental changes to their operational doctrine and the development of new countermeasures specifically designed to combat supernatural threats. The siege of the fortress world of Mordian during the Gothic War demonstrated how Chaos forces had evolved their approach to planetary assault operations, combining conventional military tactics with systematic corruption campaigns designed to weaken defender morale before the main offensive began. Chaos infiltrators spent months establishing cult cells within Mordian's population centers, their activities creating internal security threats that forced Imperial commanders to divert resources from external defenses to counter domestic terrorism. When the main assault finally commenced, the defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Mordian campaign showcased the effectiveness of combined arms operations that integrated Traitor Legion forces with demon summoning and cult uprisings, creating tactical situations that Imperial doctrines struggled to address. Space Marine defenders trained for conventional warfare found themselves facing enemies that employed supernatural abilities alongside advanced military equipment, while the presence of demon entities created psychological effects that compromised unit cohesion even among veteran formations. The planet's eventual fall provided Chaos forces with valuable intelligence about Imperial defensive capabilities while demonstrating the effectiveness of their evolved operational methods. The Vrax campaign represented a different approach to Chaos expansion, focusing on the corruption of an entire world through gradual infiltration rather than direct military conquest. The siege began when Cardinal Zaffin declared independence from Imperial authority and aligned his world with Chaos forces, creating a rebellion that required massive Imperial resources to suppress over the course of 17 years of continuous warfare. The campaign's duration reflected both the strength of Chaos defenses and the Imperium's determination to prevent the establishment of permanent Chaos strongholds within their territory. Vrax served as a testing ground for new forms of Chaos warfare that combined traditional siege tactics with biological and chemical weapons derived from Nurglite corruption. The planet's defenders employed plague weapons that infected attacking Imperial forces with supernatural diseases, while demon engines and corrupted war machines provided fire support that exceeded conventional artillery capabilities. The death corps of Krieg's eventual victory came at enormous cost, with entire regiments sacrificed to advance mere kilometers against defenses that adapted continuously to counter Imperial tactics. The coordination of these massive invasions required unprecedented cooperation between Chaos factions that normally viewed each other as competitors or enemies. Abaddon's success in achieving such coordination stemmed from his understanding that each faction's participation needed to serve their individual interests while contributing to broader strategic objectives. Khornate forces received opportunities for glorious combat that generated the bloodshed their patron demanded, while Tzeentchian sorcerers gained access to forbidden knowledge and artifacts that advanced their understanding of warp manipulation. Nurglite forces contributed their expertise in siege warfare and biological weapons, their supernatural resilience making them ideal for prolonged operations that would exhaust conventional troops. The Death Guard's participation in multiple Black Crusades provided Chaos forces with specialized capabilities in urban warfare and the systematic corruption of enemy positions through disease and chemical contamination. Their presence on battlefields transformed the nature of warfare itself, as Imperial forces found themselves fighting not only enemy soldiers, but also the environments they occupied. Slaaneshi forces provided psychological warfare capabilities and infiltration expertise that complemented the more direct approaches favored by other Chaos factions. The Emperor's Children's mastery of sensory manipulation and their understanding of human psychology made them valuable assets for operations requiring the corruption of enemy commanders or the demoralization of defender populations. Their participation in Black Crusades often focused on capturing specific individuals whose corruption would provide strategic advantages rather than simply eliminating enemy leadership. The strategic objectives pursued by these coordinated Chaos invasions reflected a sophisticated understanding of Imperial weaknesses and the requirements for long-term success in the Long War. Rather than attempting immediate conquest of Terra, Abaddon's campaigns focused on capturing Forge worlds whose industrial capabilities could support sustained Chaos operations, while providing access to advanced technologies that would enhance future military capabilities. The capture of Forge worlds also denied these resources to Imperial forces, while providing Chaos forces with the manufacturing capacity necessary to equip larger armies. The corruption of entire populations represented another key objective, as Chaos forces recognized that military conquest without spiritual conversion would prove temporary at best. Successful Black Crusades incorporated extensive psychological warfare and cult infiltration operations designed to transform conquered populations into willing servants of the Dark Gods rather than simply occupying their territories through force. This approach created self-sustaining Chaos strongholds that could continue expanding their influence even after the main invasion forces moved on to other targets. The ultimate goal of reaching Terra itself remained the driving force behind Abaddon's strategic planning, but the War Master understood that direct assault on the throne world required preliminary operations that would weaken Imperial defenses while strengthening Chaos capabilities. Each successful Black Crusade brought Chaos forces closer to achieving the military and logistical requirements necessary for a final offensive against the Emperor's palace, while simultaneously demonstrating to wavering Imperial worlds that Chaos victory was not only possible but inevitable. The 13th Black Crusade's success in destroying Cadia and creating the Great Rift fundamentally altered the strategic balance between Chaos and Imperial forces, by eliminating the primary barrier that had contained chaos expansion for 10 millennia. The planet's destruction created additional warp storms that connected the Eye of Terror to other regions of the galaxy, enabling chaos forces to launch coordinated attacks across multiple sectors simultaneously, while reducing the Imperium's ability to predict and counter their movements. The Great Rift's creation divided the Imperium into two separate regions with limited communication and coordination capabilities, forcing Imperial commanders to adapt their strategic planning to account for their inability to coordinate responses across the galaxy. Chaos forces exploited this division by launching simultaneous offensives in both regions, preventing Imperial forces from concentrating their defenses while creating opportunities for smaller Chaos factions to establish independent strongholds in previously secure sectors. The technological capabilities that enabled these massive coordinated invasions reflected millennia of development within the Eye of Terror, where Chaos forces had access to both advanced Imperial equipment captured during the Horus Heresy and innovations derived from warp-touch technologies that exceeded conventional engineering limitations. Chaos shipyards within the Eye produced vessels that combined traditional Imperial designs with demonic possession and reality-altering capabilities, creating fleets that could challenge Imperial Navy forces through supernatural as well as conventional means. The Dark Mechanicum's contributions to Chaos military capabilities provided access to forbidden technologies that Imperial forces could not match or counter effectively. These corrupted tech priests developed weapon systems that incorporated demonic entities as essential components, creating equipment that achieved effects impossible through purely mechanical means. Their understanding of machine spirits and their willingness to corrupt these entities with warp influence produced war machines that operated according to principles that Imperial tech priests could not comprehend or replicate. The weapons wielded by Chaos forces transcend mere tools of war, representing physical manifestations of the Dark God's power that blur the boundaries between the material and immaterial realms. Demon weapons stand as the most feared of these artifacts, each one housing the bound essence of a warp entity whose malevolent consciousness transforms the blade, gun, or staff into a semi-sentient instrument of destruction. These weapons offer their wielders power that exceeds any conventional armament, but their use demands a constant battle of wills between the mortal user and the demon trapped within the weapon's physical structure. The creation of demon weapons requires rituals of extraordinary complexity that bind powerful warp entities into specially prepared material forms, typically weapons of exceptional craftsmanship that can withstand the spiritual pressure of containing a demon's essence. The binding process involves elaborate ceremonies that can take months or years to complete, with sorcerers and dark tech priests working together to forge the metaphysical chains that prevent the demon from escaping, while allowing it to channel its power through the weapon's physical structure. The slightest error in these rituals can result in catastrophic failures that kill everyone involved, while releasing the demon to wreak havoc in the material realm. The most powerful demon weapons house greater demons, whose immense spiritual energy grants the artifact's capabilities that defy conventional understanding of what weapons can achieve. The demon sword Drachnian, wielded by Abaddon the Despoiler, contains an entity of such malevolent power that it can cut through any material substance, while inflicting wounds that resist both medical treatment and psychic healing. The weapon's blade appears to be forged from living shadow that writhes and shifts according to the demon's emotional state, its edge remaining impossibly sharp regardless of what it strikes. Lesser demon weapons typically contain bloodletters, plague-bearers, or other entities from the hierarchies of the individual chaos gods, their capabilities reflecting the specific nature of their bound inhabitant. A sword housing a bloodletter might burst into flames during combat, while inspiring berserker fury in nearby allies, while a plague knife containing a plague-bearer could infect wounds with supernatural diseases that spread to anyone who tends the victim. These weapons maintain constant psychic communication with their wielders, offering tactical advice and battle lore, while simultaneously attempting to corrupt their users' minds through subtle psychological manipulation. The relationship between a demon weapon and its wielder operates through a complex dynamic of mutual dependence and constant struggle for dominance. The demon requires the wielder's life force and emotional energy to maintain its manifestation in the material realm, while the mortal gains access to supernatural abilities that can turn the tide of entire battles. However, the demon never abandons its desire for freedom and constantly seeks opportunities to possess its wielder completely, transforming them into a vessel for the entity's consciousness while retaining access to their memories and skills. Experienced wielders of demon weapons learn to maintain psychological barriers that prevent their bound entities from achieving complete dominance while still allowing enough spiritual connection to access the weapon's full power. This balance requires constant vigilance and tremendous mental discipline, as moments of weakness or distraction can allow the demon to surge forward and seize control of the wielder's actions. Many promising warriors have been destroyed not by enemy action, but by their own weapons, their consciousness consumed by entities that had spent years waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The combat capabilities of demon weapons extend far beyond enhanced cutting power or improved accuracy, encompassing supernatural effects that can alter the fundamental nature of warfare. Some demon weapons can phase through solid matter to strike targets behind cover, while others generate psychic fields that cause terror in enemy formations or inspire fanatical devotion in allied troops. The most dangerous specimens can manipulate local reality within limited areas, creating effects that appear miraculous to observers who lack understanding of warp dynamics. The corruption spread by demon weapons affects not only their direct wielders, but also anyone who spends extended periods in their presence, as the bound entities constantly emit low-level psychic emanations that gradually erode moral boundaries and spiritual defenses. Soldiers who serve alongside demon weapon users often develop increasingly violent tendencies and callous attitudes towards suffering, while their dreams become filled with visions that reflect their exposure to warp influence. Over time, entire military units can become corrupted through proximity to these artifacts, their loyalty shifting from the Imperium to whatever Chaos faction claims their allegiance. The Horus Heresy's aftermath left countless demon weapons scattered across the galaxy, hidden in ancient battlefields or sealed within fortress vaults that were later forgotten or deliberately concealed. These artifacts represent time bombs of corruption that can trigger massive disasters when discovered by individuals who lack the knowledge or willpower necessary to resist their influence. Archaeological expeditions that uncover Heresy-era weapons caches often suffer complete personnel losses, with entire research teams falling to corruption or demonic possession within days of making their discoveries. The traitor legions maintain extensive armories filled with demon weapons collected over 10 millennia of warfare, their champions competing for the right to wield the most powerful artifacts, while understanding that such weapons represent both ultimate achievement and potential damnation. The process of selecting worthy wielders for these weapons involves elaborate trials that test not only combat skill, but also mental resilience and spiritual corruption, as demon weapons will only bond with individuals whose psychological profiles match their bound entities' preferences. Some demon weapons achieve such notoriety that their names become legendary throughout both Imperial and Chaos forces, their histories spanning millennia and involving dozens of different wielders who have risen to prominence through their artifacts' power. The Black Blade of Antwer has passed through the hands of multiple Chaos champions over the centuries, each wielder achieving great victories before eventually being consumed by the weapon's hunger for souls. These legendary weapons often display preferences for particular types of wielders or combat situations, their bound demons having developed sophisticated understanding of how to maximize their influence through careful selection of hosts. Beyond individual demon weapons, the Chaos forces possess access to ancient relics and artifacts that predate human civilization, their origins lost in the depths of galactic history, but their power undimmed by the passage of millennia. These Xenotech artifacts operate according to principles that neither Imperial nor Chaos Tech priests fully understand, their functions often requiring trial and error experimentation that can produce spectacular results or catastrophic failures with equal probability. The Dark Angel's pursuit of fallen space marines has led them to encounter numerous such artifacts, many of which were originally discovered during the Great Crusade and later corrupted through exposure to chaos influence. The most dangerous of these ancient artifacts appear to be remnants of civilizations that achieved technological sophistication far exceeding current galactic standards, their creators having developed methods for manipulating fundamental forces that modern science cannot replicate. Some scholars theorize that these devices represent technology from the Dark Age of technology, when humanity briefly achieved capabilities that rivaled those of the ancient Eldar, while others suggest they originated from Xeno species that were extinct before humans ever left Terra. Regardless of their origins, these artifacts consistently demonstrate effects that defy conventional understanding of physics and engineering. The Chaos Space Marines' access to Heresy-era equipment provides them with weapons and armor that incorporate technologies the Imperium can no longer produce, their manufacturing techniques having been lost during the Age of Strife or deliberately suppressed by the Adeptus Mechanicus. These relics often display superior performance compared to modern Imperial equipment, their creators having possessed knowledge and resources that current tech priests view with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The Iron Warriors maintain particularly extensive collections of such equipment, their siege specialists having preserved detailed technical documentation that allows them to maintain and modify ancient weapon systems. Chaos artifacts created during the Horus Heresy itself carry special significance because they were forged during the galaxy's greatest civil war, their metal having been exposed to psychic emanations of unprecedented intensity as billions died in conflicts that raged across hundreds of worlds. Weapons and armor created during this period often display supernatural properties even without deliberate chaos corruption, their materials having absorbed enough psychic energy to develop rudimentary machine spirits that respond to their wielders' emotional states. These semi-sentient artifacts can provide enhanced performance during critical moments while gradually influencing their users' psychology through subtle psychic feedback. The Dark Mechanicum represents the most systematic approach to developing chaos technology, their corrupted tech priests having abandoned the orthodox doctrines of the Adeptus Mechanicus in favor of experimental techniques that incorporate demonic entities as integral components of their creations. These heretical engineers view the machine spirits venerated by orthodox tech priests as primitive precursors to true artificial consciousness, seeking to create fully sentient machines that can think and act independently while serving their creators' purposes. Their research combines traditional engineering knowledge with forbidden insights gained through pacts with warp entities. Demon engines represent the Dark Mechanicum's most visible achievements, massive war machines that house bound demons within mechanical frameworks designed to channel and focus their supernatural abilities. These constructs combine the durability and firepower of conventional vehicles with the unpredictable capabilities of warp entities, creating weapons platforms that can achieve effects impossible through purely mechanical means. The Defiler, perhaps the most common demon engine, mounts heavy weapons on a spider-like chassis animated by a demon whose malevolent intelligence allows it to navigate complex terrain while engaging multiple targets simultaneously. The creation of demon engines requires the same binding rituals used for demon weapons, but scaled up to accommodate the vastly more powerful entities needed to animate large mechanical constructs. The process involves the systematic corruption of machine spirits through exposure to warp energies, gradually transforming the vehicle's artificial consciousness into something capable of hosting a demonic presence. The bound demon provides the engine with supernatural durability and the ability to repair battle damage through force of will, while the mechanical framework gives the entity a stable platform for projecting its power into the material realm. The Hell Talon fighter bomber exemplifies how demon engines can can exceed the performance limitations of conventional aircraft through supernatural enhancement of their basic capabilities. The demon bound within the aircraft's frame can manipulate local air currents to achieve impossible maneuvers, while its malevolent intelligence allows it to anticipate enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. The plane's weapon systems benefit from demonic guidance that ensures maximum destructive effect, while its armor can temporarily phase out of reality to avoid incoming fire before rematerializing to continue its attack runs. Possessed machines represent a more subtle form of dark mechanicum corruption, involving the gradual infection of Imperial equipment with demonic influence rather than the deliberate binding of specific entities. This process typically begins when captured Imperial vehicles are exposed to prolonged warp energy or subjected to corruption rituals that weaken the barriers protecting their machine spirits. The resulting hybrid consciousness combines the original machine spirit's knowledge and capabilities with demonic malevolence and supernatural abilities, creating equipment that appears normal but behaves in increasingly erratic and dangerous ways. The corruption of standard template constructs represents perhaps the greatest threat posed by dark mechanicum activities, as these ancient databases contain the manufacturing specifications for technologies that could revolutionize galactic warfare if properly implemented. The dark mechanicum's willingness to experiment with forbidden modifications to SDC patterns has produced weapon systems and equipment that exceed Imperial capabilities, while incorporating design elements that gradually corrupt anyone who uses them. These corrupted SDCs spread through black market networks and captured equipment caches, their influence extending far beyond the original corruption sites. The Decimator Demon Engine demonstrates how corrupted SDC technology can produce weapons that combine the reliability of ancient human engineering with the unpredictable power of bound demons. These bipedal war machines mount various weapon configurations on frames that can adapt their structure according to battlefield requirements, their demonic intelligence allowing them to modify their armament and defensive systems in response to specific threats. The Decimator's ability to reconfigure itself during combat makes it nearly impossible for enemy forces to develop effective countermeasures. Imperial technology proves surprisingly vulnerable to chaos corruption due to the machine spirits that inhabit virtually all complex equipment, these artificial consciousnesses providing entry points that demonic entities can exploit to gain influence over mechanical systems. The corruption process typically begins with subtle malfunctions that appear to be normal wear or maintenance issues, gradually escalating as the demon gains greater control over the infected system. Weapons might develop preferences for particular targets or begin firing without authorization, while vehicles could refuse to start at critical moments or drive themselves into dangerous situations. The Adeptus Mechanicus's religious approach to technology creates additional vulnerabilities that chaos forces can exploit through corruption of the rituals and prayers used to maintain complex equipment. Dark Mechanicum infiltrators work to introduce subtle modifications to maintenance procedures that gradually expose machine spirits to warp influence while appearing to follow orthodox protocols. These corrupted rituals can spread through tech priest communities like viruses, each infected practitioner unknowingly passing the corruption to their colleagues and subordinates. Vox systems and communication networks prove particularly susceptible to demonic interference because their function requires the transmission of information across vast distances, creating opportunities for warp entities to intercept and modify messages during transmission. Chaos sorcerers can implant demon familiars within communication hubs that monitor Imperial transmissions while inserting false information designed to create confusion and misdirect military responses. These corrupted networks can operate undetected for years, their influence gradually spreading as infected nodes contaminate additional communication links. The corruption of Titan machine spirits represents one of the most catastrophic failures that can befall Imperial forces, as these massive war machines possess artificial consciousnesses of extraordinary sophistication that, when corrupted, become nearly unstoppable engines of destruction. The process typically requires direct exposure to powerful demon entities or prolonged combat operations in areas with high warp activity, the Titan's machine's spirit gradually succumbing to influences that its original programming cannot resist. Corrupted Titans retain their full combat capabilities while serving new masters whose goals involve maximum destruction and the spread of chaos influence. The Legio Mortis exemplifies how entire Titan legions can fall to chaos corruption through systematic exposure to warp influence during extended campaigns, their machines' spirits gradually developing preferences for destruction over protection as demonic entities establish psychological footholds within their artificial consciousness. These corrupted god machines maintain their tactical sophistication while pursuing objectives that prioritize carnage and terror over strategic military goals, their massive weapons reducing Imperial strongholds to rubble, while their crews descend into madness that mirrors their machines' corruption. Chaos forces actively seek to capture and corrupt Imperial equipment rather than simply destroying it, recognizing that turned weapons and vehicles provide greater long-term value than battlefield victories alone. Specialized Dark Mechanicum teams accompany major Chaos offensives with the specific mission of identifying valuable Imperial technology that can be corrupted and repurposed for Chaos use. These tech heretics possess extensive knowledge of Imperial systems and the specific rituals needed to corrupt different types of equipment, their expertise allowing them to transform captured materiel into effective weapons against their former owners. The dimensional barriers separating the Immaterium from the Immaterium become increasingly unstable when exposed to concentrated psychic phenomena, creating reality distortions that transform the fundamental nature of space and time within affected regions. These manifestations begin subtly, with minor temporal anomalies that cause chronometers to run backward or gravitational fields that fluctuate according to the emotional states of nearby psychers. As warp influence intensifies, these distortions escalate into full-scale reality breakdowns, where the laws of physics become meaningless and thought achieves physical substance. Proximity to major warp rifts creates zones of dimensional instability that extend far beyond the visible boundaries of the tiers themselves, their influence seeping through real space like poison through water. Within these affected regions, psychic phenomena manifest with increasing frequency and intensity as the barrier between dimensions grows progressively thinner. Astropaths operating near the Eye of Terror report that their telepathic communications often arrive at their destinations before being sent, while navigator families stationed on worlds within several hundred light-years of major warp storms experience mutation rates that exceed those found in the general population by orders of magnitude. The reality distortions generated by warp proximity follow patterns that correlate with the specific nature of the dimensional breach and the entities that inhabit it. Areas influenced by Khornate warp storms experience gravitational anomalies that cause metal objects to become superheated during moments of intense emotion, while regions affected by Tzeentchian rifts develop crystalline formations that grow according to mathematical sequences that hurt the minds of those who attempt to calculate their progression. Nurglite corruption manifests through the spontaneous decay of organic and inorganic matter alike, with plasteel bulkheads developing rust patterns that spread like living organisms. Slaneshi influence creates the most insidious reality distortions because they often appear beneficial or aesthetically pleasing to casual observers, masking their dangerous nature behind facades of impossible beauty. Worlds within the Dark Prince's sphere of influence develop atmospheric phenomena that produce aurora displays of unprecedented magnificence, their colors existing in spectrums that human eyes cannot normally perceive. These displays trigger powerful emotional responses in viewers, while gradually altering their neurochemistry through exposure to psychoactive radiation that exists partially within the warp. Temporal anomalies represent perhaps the most dangerous form of reality distortion because they can trap entire populations in causality loops that prevent normal progression of events. Imperial Guard regiments deployed to worlds near major warp storms have reported engaging enemy forces that appear to be fighting battles from decades or centuries in the past, their weapons and tactics corresponding to historical conflicts, while their opponents remain unaware of the temporal displacement. These chronological disturbances create tactical nightmares for Imperial commanders who find themselves unable to predict enemy movements because their opponents operate according to strategic situations that no longer exist. The most severe temporal distortions can create regions where past and future events occur simultaneously, generating paradoxes that strain the human mind's ability to comprehend causality. Inquisitorial investigation teams exploring these areas often discover evidence of their own deaths in locations they have never visited, while encountering individuals who claim to have fought alongside them in battles that have not yet occurred. These temporal overlaps make coherent military operations impossible because cause and effect relationships become meaningless within the affected zones. Gravitational anomalies manifest when warp energy interferes with the fundamental forces that govern matter's behavior in real space, creating localized regions where objects fall upward or achieve weightlessness without apparent cause. These distortions follow symbolic rather than mathematical relationships, with gravity's strength and direction responding to psychological factors rather than mass distribution. A space marine's faith in the Emperor might cause him to remain anchored to the ground, while his battle brothers float helplessly in zero gravity, their lack of absolute conviction translating into reduced gravitational attraction. The most extreme gravitational distortions can reverse the flow of entropy within limited areas, causing shattered objects to reassemble themselves, while wounds heal in reverse chronological order. These effects appear miraculous to observers who lack understanding of warp dynamics, but they carry hidden costs that become apparent only after extended exposure. Individuals who experience reversed entropy often find that their memories begin operating in reverse chronological order, with recent events becoming increasingly difficult to recall, while childhood experiences achieve photographic clarity. Electromagnetic phenomena in warp-influenced regions operate according to principles that defy conventional understanding of energy and matter interaction. Vox systems near dimensional rifts receive transmissions from sources that do not exist, their speakers broadcasting conversations between individuals who died centuries ago or messages from futures that may never come to pass. These phantom communications often contain accurate intelligence about current events, but their reliability decreases proportionally to their strategic value, creating information sources that prove most useful when their content matters least. Power generation systems exposed to sustained warp influence begin producing energy that exhibits properties unknown to Imperial science, their output fluctuating according to the emotional states of their operators rather than fuel consumption or mechanical efficiency. Plasma reactors near warp storms sometimes generate electricity that carries psychic charge, causing equipment powered by these sources to develop rudimentary consciousness or begin responding to telepathic commands. These energized systems can provide enhanced performance during critical moments, but they also attract demonic attention that increases the likelihood of catastrophic possession events. The corruption of planets located near major warp storms represents the ultimate manifestation of dimensional instability, as sustained exposure to chaos influence gradually transforms entire worlds into demon realms where reality operates according to warp logic rather than physical laws. These demon worlds serve as permanent footholds for chaos forces in the material universe, their transformed environments providing staging areas for invasions, while demonstrating the ultimate consequences of unchecked warp corruption. The transformation process begins with subtle alterations to local weather patterns and geological activity, as the planet's natural systems begin responding to psychic emanations rather than purely physical forces. Atmospheric composition shifts to include gases that exist primarily within the warp, while tectonic activity follows patterns that correspond to the emotional states of the world's population rather than geological pressure distribution. These changes accelerate as the dimensional barrier continues to weaken, eventually reaching a critical threshold where the planet's entire structure becomes malleable to conscious will. Demon worlds dedicated to Khorne manifest as endless battlefields where the concepts of warfare and bloodshed achieve physical form, their landscapes consisting of brass fortifications and crimson plains that stretch beyond the horizon. The ground itself consists of congealed blood from countless battles, its surface remaining perpetually liquid despite the absence of any heat source. Massive skull pyramids rise from these gore-soaked plains, their construction following architectural principles that prioritize intimidation over structural integrity while somehow maintaining perfect stability despite their impossible geometry. The atmosphere on Khornate demon worlds burns with perpetual rage, its composition including psychic particles that induce aggressive behavior in any creature capable of breathing it. Weather patterns consist of blood rain and brass hail that falls from skies colored the deep crimson of arterial bleeding, while lightning strikes carry the screams of warriors who died in glorious combat. The planet's magnetic field generates aurora displays that depict massive battles between armies of light, their conflicts playing out across the heavens in endless cycles of victory and defeat. Tzeentchian demon worlds exhibit constantly shifting geography that prevents the creation of accurate maps, their landscapes transforming according to mathematical formulas that operate on scales both microscopic and planetary. Crystalline formations grow and dissolve according to equations that describe the flow of change throughout the galaxy, while forests of living mathematics bloom with theorems that solve themselves before evolving into new problems. The planet's surface consists of materials that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, their properties changing according to the observer's level of understanding and psychic sensitivity. The weather systems on worlds claimed by the Changer of Ways operate through symbolic relationships rather than thermodynamic processes, with precipitation consisting of crystallized hope and despair that falls in patterns corresponding to the ambitions of sentient beings throughout the surrounding sector. Winds carry whispers of forbidden knowledge in languages that change as they are heard, while atmospheric pressure fluctuates according to the complexity of schemes being hatched by inhabitants of nearby star systems. The planet's day-night cycle follows no consistent pattern, instead alternating between illumination and darkness according to the success or failure of various plots and conspiracies. Nurglite demon worlds achieve a grotesque form of ecological balance where decay and growth exist in perfect harmony, their biospheres supporting impossible diversity through the systematic recycling of death into new forms of life. Swamps of infectious materials stretch across continents, their waters teeming with microscopic organisms that serve as the building blocks for larger parasitic entities. Trees constructed from living bone support canopies of diseased flesh that provides shelter for creatures whose existence depends on the consumption of corruption. The atmospheric composition on Plague Father's worlds includes airborne pathogens that exist partially within the warp, their infection vectors operating through emotional contact as well as physical transmission. Weather consists of plague rain that carries beneficial diseases to those who accept Nurgle's gifts while inflicting agonizing symptoms on individuals who resist corruption. The planet's soil consists of composted organic matter from countless worlds, its fertility enabling the growth of crops that provide sustenance, while gradually transforming consumers into willing servants of decay. Slaaneshi demon worlds achieve aesthetic perfection that conceals predatory dangers beneath surfaces of impossible beauty, their landscapes designed to provide overwhelming sensory experiences that gradually erode visitors' psychological defenses. Gardens of living sculpture populate continents where every flower, tree, and blade of grass achieves mathematical perfection according to beauty standards from multiple species. The planet's architecture incorporates elements from every civilization that has ever pursued artistic excellence, creating structures that inspire powerful emotional responses while subtly manipulating observers' neurochemistry. The atmospheric conditions on worlds claimed by the Dark Prince stimulate every possible sensory experience simultaneously, creating environments where the boundary between pleasure and pain becomes meaningless. Weather patterns produce precipitation that triggers specific emotional responses in those it touches, while atmospheric pressure creates acoustic effects that transform natural sounds into music of transcendent beauty. The planet's magnetic field generates psychoactive radiation that directly stimulates pleasure centers in the brain, creating dependencies that make departure from the world's surface psychologically impossible for most visitors. Extended exposure to chaos corruption produces physical and mental mutations in mortals that reflect the specific nature of their contamination source, while gradually transforming them into creatures that exist partially within the warp. These changes begin subtly, with minor alterations to appearance or behavior that might be attributed to stress or environmental factors. A clerk exposed to Tzeentchian influence might develop enhanced mathematical abilities alongside a compulsive need to reorganize filing systems according to increasingly complex patterns, while a soldier affected by Khornate corruption could experience improved reflexes accompanied by difficulty controlling aggressive impulses. The mutation process accelerates as exposure continues, with physical changes becoming increasingly obvious, while mental alterations fundamentally reshape the victim's personality and priorities. Tzeentchian corruption typically manifests through the development of additional sensory organs or limbs that enhance the individual's ability to perceive and manipulate their environment, while their thought patterns become increasingly complex and difficult for unaffected humans to follow. These individuals often develop obsessions with change and improvement that drive them to constantly modify their surroundings and social relationships. Khornate mutations focus on enhancing combat capabilities through the development of natural weapons, improved strength and endurance, or sensory adaptations that make the individual more effective in battle. Affected individuals grow bone spurs that can serve as claws or spikes, while their muscle mass increases beyond normal human limitations without corresponding changes to their skeletal structure. Their nervous systems adapt to provide faster reaction times and reduce sensitivity to pain, but these improvements come at the cost of decreased empathy and increased aggression that makes peaceful social interaction increasingly difficult. Nerglite corruption produces mutations that integrate beneficial parasites and diseases into the victim's biology, creating symbiotic relationships that enhance survival capabilities while gradually transforming appearance in ways that most humans find repulsive. These individuals develop immunity to conventional diseases and toxins, while gaining the ability to survive in hostile environments that would kill normal humans. Their bodies become breeding grounds for supernatural organisms that provide enhanced healing and endurance, but their appearance becomes increasingly corpse-like as their flesh takes on the characteristics of living carrion. Slaaneshi mutations enhance sensory capabilities and aesthetic appeal, while introducing subtle predatory characteristics that reflect the Dark Prince's dual nature as patron of both creation and destruction. Affected individuals develop enhanced sensitivity to all forms of stimulation, alongside improved physical coordination and grace, their movements achieving a hypnotic quality that makes them naturally attractive to others. However, these improvements come with increased psychological instability and compulsive behavior patterns that drive them to seek ever more extreme experiences. The final stage of uncontrolled mutation transforms individuals into chaos spawn, writhing masses of flesh that incorporate random body parts from multiple species, while retaining fragments of their original consciousness trapped within forms that can no longer support coherent thought. These creatures represent the ultimate failure of mortal flesh to withstand chaos corruption, their existence serving as warnings about the dangers of pursuing power through warp entities without proper preparation or protection. Chaos spawn retain enough intelligence to follow simple commands and recognize familiar individuals, but their constantly shifting anatomy prevents them from developing consistent capabilities or maintaining stable personalities. Their forms change continuously as competing genetic patterns struggle for dominance, with new limbs, sensory organs, and defensive features appearing and disappearing according to environmental pressures and random chance. These creatures feel constant pain from their unstable biology, their suffering generating psychic emanations that attract additional chaos corruption while repelling most forms of beneficial intervention. Faith in the Emperor represents the most reliable defense against chaos corruption, as genuine devotion creates psychic barriers that protect believers from direct warp influence, while providing resistance to the subtle psychological manipulation that precedes physical mutation. The strength of these protective effects correlates directly with the depth and sincerity of the individual's faith rather than their formal religious education or ceremonial observance. A simple factory worker who maintains absolute conviction in the Emperor's protection may prove more resistant to corruption than a trained priest whose devotion has been compromised by doubt or intellectual pride. The protective mechanisms of faith operate through the creation of stable psychic patterns that resist the chaotic influences emanating from warp entities and corrupted environments. These mental structures function like immune systems for the soul, identifying and neutralizing foreign influences before they can establish permanent footholds within the believer's consciousness. The process requires constant reinforcement through prayer, meditation, and participation in communal religious activities that strengthen the individual's connection to the Emperor, while providing social support networks that can identify and address early signs of corruption. Willpower serves as another crucial defense against chaos influence, particularly for individuals whose duties require exposure to corrupted materials or environments where faith alone proves insufficient. Strong-willed individuals can maintain their psychological integrity through conscious resistance to corrupting influences, their mental discipline providing barriers that prevent warp entities from establishing the emotional connections necessary for successful possession or mutation. This resistance requires tremendous mental effort and cannot be sustained indefinitely without support from other protective measures. The development of effective willpower-based defenses requires extensive training in meditation techniques and psychological discipline that enable individuals to recognize and resist subtle forms of mental manipulation. The most successful practitioners learn to compartmentalize their consciousness, creating protected mental spaces where their core personality and values remain isolated from external influences. These techniques prove particularly valuable for inquisitors and other Imperial agents whose duties require direct contact with chaos artifacts and corrupted individuals. Psychic null fields represent the most absolute form of protection against warp influence, as these phenomena create zones where psychic energy cannot function normally and demon entities cannot maintain stable manifestation. Null fields are generated by rare individuals known as blanks or pariahs, whose unique neurological structure creates areas of psychic vacuum that repel warp-based phenomena while causing intense discomfort to psychers and other psychically sensitive individuals. The Culexis Temple trains these individuals as specialized assassins whose presence alone can disrupt enemy psychers and demon summoning rituals. The protective effects of null fields extend beyond simple psychic suppression to encompass resistance to reality distortions and temporal anomalies that plague regions with high warp activity. Equipment and personnel within these fields maintain normal function even in environments where the laws of physics have been compromised by chaos influence, making null field generators valuable assets for operations in heavily corrupted areas. However, the technology required to artificially generate these fields remains poorly understood and extremely difficult to manufacture, limiting their deployment to the most critical situations. The interaction between different protective measures creates synergistic effects that provide enhanced resistance to chaos corruption when properly coordinated. Faith-based protection works most effectively when supported by strong willpower and community reinforcement, while technological defenses function best when operated by individuals whose personal integrity remains intact. The most successful anti-chaos operations combine all available protective measures into comprehensive defense systems that address both the supernatural and psychological aspects of warp-based threats. the Imperium's defensive strategies against the eternal threat of chaos have evolved over 10 millennia of constant warfare, creating layered systems of protection that combine military might, spiritual vigilance, and technological barriers against the corrupting influence of the warp. At the forefront of this defense stands the Inquisition, whose agents operate throughout human space with unlimited authority to investigate, judge, and eliminate any trace of chaos corruption before it can spread beyond containment. The Ordo Malleus specializes in combating demonic threats, maintaining extensive databases of chaos cult activities, while deploying specialized teams trained in recognizing the subtle signs of warp influence that conventional Imperial forces might overlook. Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus undergo decades of training that prepares them to confront horrors that would shatter the minds of ordinary humans, their education encompassing forbidden knowledge about demon hierarchies, chaos corruption patterns, and the specific weaknesses that can be exploited to banish warp entities back to the Immaterium. These agents learn to recognize the early stages of cult formation, from the psychological vulnerabilities that make individuals susceptible to chaos recruitment to the ritual practices that indicate escalating corruption within affected populations. Their authority extends to requisitioning entire Space Marine chapters when situations require military intervention beyond the capabilities of conventional Imperial Guard forces. The Grey Knights represent the Imperium's ultimate weapon against demonic incursion, their entire existence dedicated to hunting and destroying the servants of the ruinous powers wherever they manifest in real space. Created from the purest genetic material available during the Horus Heresy, these Space Marines possess natural resistance to chaos corruption that allows them to operate in environments that would doom other Imperial forces. Their training incorporates extensive psychic conditioning alongside conventional combat techniques, preparing them to face enemies whose very presence can drive mortals to madness or mutation through proximity alone. Each Grey Knight undergoes rigorous mental conditioning that creates psychological barriers capable of withstanding direct assault by greater demons, their minds protected by layers of psychic defenses that prevent corruption even during prolonged exposure to warp entities. Their weapons and armor incorporate blessed silver and other materials that prove particularly effective against demonic manifestations, while their tactical doctrine emphasizes rapid deployment and overwhelming force application, designed to destroy chaos threats before they can establish permanent footholds in the material universe. The chapter maintains strike cruisers positioned throughout Imperial space, their crews ready to respond within hours to reports of demonic activity. The Grey Knights' operational methods reflect their understanding that chaos corruption spreads like a contagion, requiring immediate quarantine and elimination of all potentially infected personnel and materials. Their interventions often result in the complete sterilization of affected areas, including the execution of Imperial Guard regiments and civilian populations that have been exposed to demonic influence. This ruthless approach stems from hard-learned experience that demonstrates how even minor exposure to chaos entities can create long-term corruption that manifests months or years after the initial contact, making thorough elimination the only reliable method for preventing future outbreaks. For 10,000 years, the fortress world of Cadia served as the cornerstone of Imperial defensive strategy against chaos expansion, its strategic position controlling the Cadian Gate providing the only stable route for large-scale military forces to approach the Eye of Terror. The planet's massive defensive installations included orbital weapons platforms capable of destroying entire fleets, while its surface bristled with fortress complexes that could withstand prolonged siege by demon armies. Cadian shock troops trained on this world developed legendary expertise in fighting chaos forces, their regiments serving throughout the galaxy as specialists in anti-demon warfare, whose experience proved invaluable during major incursions. The Cadian military doctrine emphasized defensive warfare and the systematic elimination of chaos corruption through combined arms operations that integrated conventional forces with specialized anti-demon units. Cadian officers learned to recognize the signs of demonic possession among their own troops while maintaining the psychological resilience necessary to make difficult tactical decisions when corruption threatened unit integrity. Their training programs incorporated extensive education about chaos tactics and the specific capabilities of different demon types, creating a professional military culture that viewed the Long War as a technical challenge requiring expertise and discipline rather than mere courage. Cadian defensive systems extended far beyond the planet's surface to encompass the entire Gate region, with monitoring stations and patrol fleets maintaining constant surveillance of the approaches from the Eye of Terror. These installations provided early warning of Black Crusade preparations, while gathering intelligence about Chaos Force movements and tactical innovations. The information collected by these observation networks allowed Imperial strategists to predict enemy objectives and deploy countermeasures before major offensives could achieve their goals, creating a defensive advantage that compensated for the Imperium's inability to launch preemptive strikes into the Eye itself. The destruction of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade fundamentally altered the strategic balance between Imperial and Chaos forces, eliminating the primary choke point that had constrained Chaos expansion for 10 millennia. Abaddon's successful deployment of the Blackstone Fortress against the planet created a catastrophic chain reaction that tore the world apart while simultaneously destabilizing the local warp barriers that had maintained the Cadian Gate's stability. The planet's death throes generated massive psychic shockwaves that rippled through both real space and the Immaterium, creating additional tiers in the dimensional fabric that connected the Eye of Terror to distant regions of the galaxy. The Great Rift emerged from Cadia's destruction as a massive warp storm that split the galaxy in half, its chaotic energies creating a permanent barrier that severely limited communication and travel between the Imperium's eastern and western regions. This galactic division forced Imperial commanders to adapt their strategic planning to account for their inability to coordinate responses across the entire Imperium, while Chaos forces exploited the new opportunities for expansion that the Rift's creation provided. The storm's influence extended far beyond its visible boundaries, creating zones of dimensional instability throughout both halves of the divided galaxy. The opening of the Great Rift ushered in the Era Indomitus, a new age of warfare characterized by increased demon activity and the emergence of chaos strongholds in previously secure sectors. The Rift's creation allowed demon armies to manifest directly in real space without requiring the complex summoning rituals that had previously limited their deployment, while its psychic emanations strengthened existing chaos cults and triggered new corruption outbreaks throughout human space. Imperial forces found themselves fighting simultaneous campaigns across dozens of sectors as chaos warbands poured through the dimensional tiers that connected the Great Rift to other regions of the galaxy. The Imperium's response to this new threat required fundamental changes to their defensive strategy, as the traditional approach of containing chaos expansion through fortified choke points became impossible when demon armies could appear anywhere along the Rift's length. Imperial commanders developed new tactical doctrines emphasizing rapid response capabilities and the creation of mobile reserve forces that could deploy quickly to counter emerging threats. The Primaris Space Marines' introduction provided enhanced capabilities specifically designed to address the increased threat level that characterized warfare in the Era Indomitus. Despite the catastrophic changes brought by the Great Rift's opening, the fundamental nature of the conflict between order and chaos remained unchanged, reflecting the cyclical patterns that have defined galactic history since the birth of the first Chaos Gods. Neither side possesses the capability to achieve ultimate victory because their conflict stems from the basic nature of sentient consciousness itself, with the Chaos Gods drawing their power from the same emotional and psychological drives that enable civilization to exist. Every act of courage that strengthens Imperial resistance also generates the martial fury that feeds Khorne's power, while the ambition necessary for technological progress provides sustenance for Tzeentch's schemes. The cyclical nature of this eternal war manifests through periods of chaos ascendancy followed by Imperial resurgence, with neither side able to maintain permanent advantage over extended timescales. Major chaos victories like the Horus Heresy or the 13th Black Crusade create opportunities for rapid expansion that eventually exhaust themselves as Imperial forces adapt to new threat patterns and develop effective countermeasures. Similarly, Imperial crusades that reclaim lost territories and eliminate chaos strongholds generate the very conflicts and casualties that strengthen the Dark Gods, ensuring that temporary victories cannot eliminate the underlying source of corruption. This perpetual struggle reflects the fundamental paradox that humanity represents both chaos's greatest enemy and its most prolific source of sustenance, creating feedback loops that ensure the conflict's continuation regardless of tactical outcomes. Imperial citizens who resist chaos corruption with absolute faith generate psychic emanations that strengthen the Emperor's presence in the warp, but their very resistance creates the emotional intensity that feeds the Dark God's power. The courage displayed by Space Marines in battle against demon armies provides spiritual reinforcement for Imperial morale, while simultaneously offering tribute to Khorne through the violence of their combat. Human ambition drives the technological innovation and political organization necessary for the Imperium's survival, but these same drives provide Tzeentch with the psychic sustenance required to maintain his influence over mortal affairs. The acceptance of mortality and suffering that enables Imperial citizens to endure the galaxy's harsh realities feeds Nurgle's power, while the pursuit of excellence in art, warfare, and governance offers tribute to Slaanesh through the intensity of experience these activities generate. Every aspect of human civilization contributes to both sides of the eternal conflict, making victory impossible for either faction. The Imperium's defensive strategies must therefore focus on containing and managing chaos influence rather than eliminating it entirely, accepting that the threat will persist as long as humanity maintains the psychological characteristics that enable civilized existence. This understanding shapes Imperial doctrine at every level, from the individual Space Marines training in resisting corruption to the grand strategic planning that guides Crusade deployments across multiple sectors. The goal becomes not the destruction of chaos, but the maintenance of sufficient resistance to prevent humanity's complete absorption into the Dark God's domain. The Emperor's continuing presence on the Golden Throne serves as the ultimate symbol of this eternal struggle, his psychic power providing the astronomicon that enables Imperial civilization, while his physical form slowly decays under the burden of containing forces that could destroy Terra itself. His sacrifice demonstrates both the possibility of resistance against chaos and the ultimate cost that such resistance demands, creating a paradigm that defines Imperial culture and military doctrine throughout human space. The throne's maintenance requires the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers whose souls feed the Emperor's power, illustrating how the defense against chaos consumes the very people it seeks to protect. The Adeptus Astartes embody this paradox through their dual nature, as humanity's protectors and instruments of violence, whose very existence generates the warfare that strengthens chaos. Space Marines represent the pinnacle of human achievement in creating warriors capable of resisting corruption, while wielding power sufficient to challenge demon armies, but their enhanced capabilities require psychological conditioning that distances them from normal human experience. Their gene seed modifications create beings who exist between mortality and transcendence, their loyalty to the Emperor providing spiritual anchor, while their combat capabilities generate the bloodshed that feeds the Dark Gods. The Long War's continuation ensures that neither the Imperium nor Chaos can achieve the stable dominance that would end the galaxy's perpetual conflict, creating a dynamic equilibrium that preserves both civilization and corruption in eternal opposition. This balance reflects the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, with order and chaos representing complementary aspects of existence that cannot be separated without destroying the whole. The galaxy's future depends not on the victory of either side, but on the maintenance of sufficient tension between them to prevent the stagnation that would result from either absolute order or complete chaos. In this eternal struggle, humanity serves as both the prize and the battlefield, their consciousness providing the arena where the forces of order and chaos wage their endless war. the Imperium's survival depends on maintaining the delicate balance that preserves human civilization while acknowledging the dark truths about the nature of existence that make such preservation possible. The Emperor's vision of a galaxy united under human rule remains as distant as ever, but the struggle to achieve that impossible dream continues to generate the hope and determination that make resistance possible, ensuring that the war between light and darkness will continue as long as humanity endures among the stars.